Hey guys, tonight we slip off the main road, past a crumbling stone milestone that no one's read in 100 years, and into the deep, brambled wilds of feudal England. The air grows thick with damp moss and chimney smoke, the smell of peat fires drifting across your path. You're alone, or at least you think you are. Every crunch of leaf underfoot seems like it echoes too long. Every distant hoot sounds just a bit too theatrical. You're not trespassing, not exactly. Or well, maybe you are. See, in this version of England, forests aren't just woods. They're territories where the king's word trumps all, where hunting a rabbit could earn you a trial without a jury, and where gathering the wrong stick could leave you handless. You're in the king's forest now, and that means something unnervingly specific and disturbingly bureaucratic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking on a soggy woodland path, the kind trodden thin by generations of hooves and cartwheels, worn smooth in some places and treacherously slippery in others. To your left is a hedgerow that looks suspiciously cultivated, not by nature, but by long-forgotten hands. The trees arch overhead like the ribs of a cathedral, filtering moonlight in lazy beams. And though the silence hums with a sleepy rhythm, this forest is anything but free. It's the late 1100s, and the king, Henry II at the moment, has inherited not just land but laws older than many of his castles. The forest, in legal terms, is a bizarre pocket of royal privilege. Parallel jurisdiction, a place where normal England stops and forest law begins. And unfortunately for you, you've wandered right into it. The definition of forest back then doesn't align with your modern imagination. It doesn't have to be wooded. It might include farms, entire villages, even cathedrals. What mattered wasn't the trees, it was the designation. If the king said it was forest, it was forest. And the king said a lot of things were forest. William the Conqueror, after 1066, had a particular fondness for this system. He expanded royal forests massively, especially in the south. It wasn't about conservation, it was about exclusivity. The king and his pals wanted places to hunt boar and deer, undisturbed by pesky locals or inconvenient peasants trying to survive. And that's where you come in. You're a thatcher's apprentice, or maybe a runaway with a sack of questionable mushrooms. You step over a root and into a legal minefield. The ground beneath your feet might be crown land. The game hiding in the ferns? Protected. That bough in your hand? Contraband. Even the firewood you picked up for your evening stew could incriminate you. Welcome to forest law, a network of rules so vast and specific it makes modern tax codes look breezy. Point one mainstream historical fact. Here's a good one. Under King Henry II, up to 1/3 of southern England was under forest law. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's real, enforceable territory where forest officials had the power to arrest, fine, and mutilate. And here's your quirky tidbit. Dogs were illegal here. Well, most of them. Peasants with dogs were required to law them, have the poor creatures maimed by removing the claws on their front feet so they couldn't chase deer. That's right. Your sleepy, squirrel-chasing spaniel? A walking violation. Historians still argue whether this legal mess was ever truly enforceable. Some claim the laws were more threat than practice, a kind of social muzzle rather than a constant force. Others argue it was very real, especially when nobles wanted to make a point or collect some easy fines. But you're just trying to find a dry patch of earth for the night. And now you're nervously checking every tree, every leaf, half expecting a shadowy forester to emerge with a lantern and a list of infractions you didn't know existed. You follow a deer trail downhill toward the sound of running water, hoping for safety, or at least plausible deniability. The path bends. Your boots sink into mud. And just ahead, you see it. An old wooden post with faded carvings, marking the edge of forest proper. You're deeper in now. The rules shift again. You sit on a mossy log, trying not to look too illegal. Welcome to the Greenwood. You probably won't survive this. You sit still on that log for a while, hoping the damp doesn't soak through. The moon rises a little higher. Somewhere far off, an owl hoots with theatrical timing, as if it's in on the joke. You glance around. Not for wolves, not for thieves, but for something far worse in this neck of the woods. A royal official. The truth is, you're not alone out here. You never really are in the forest, not in feudal England. Not since William the Conqueror made the whole thing his back garden. And like any good monarch, he didn't tend it alone. He appointed caretakers, enforcers of law and keepers of order. Tonight, if you're unlucky, you might meet one. The royal forest, as it turns out, had its own miniature government. An entire bureaucratic forest service centuries before anyone thought to call it that. And at the top of this leafy pyramid, the justiciar of the forest. A man so powerful he could overrule your village reeve and your local lord if he thought your goat had chewed a protected branch. But he was more of a rare visitor. The day-to-day was handled by a crew of wonderfully medieval-sounding characters. Foresters, verdeers, agisters, and regarders. All of them watching. Always watching. Let's start with the foresters. These were the boots-on-the-ground types, tasked with patrolling the forest, catching poachers, and ensuring the king's venison was safe and happy. Think of them as park rangers with a taste for fines and the occasional bit of bribe-taking. Then came the verdeers. Elected by the local gentry, they had the lofty job of judging forest offenses at special courts. You might imagine them as middle managers with scrolls and seals, wandering from glade to glade muttering about regulations. Agisters had one of the odder jobs. They monitored livestock grazing in the forest. That's right. If your pigs were let loose to snuffle for acorns, someone made a note. If your cows were left too long, someone came calling. It's forest law, remember, every blade of grass counts. And finally, regarders who sound vaguely threatening, and rightly so. They performed the great regard of the forest every few years. A sweeping inspection where every irregularity, from illegal cottages to overenthusiastic firewood collectors, was documented. Think surprise audits, but mossier. Each of these roles came with power and the chance to abuse it. It wasn't uncommon for foresters to take a cut from poachers, or turn a blind eye to certain friends of the court. Some even sold off rights to deadwood and underbrush like personal property. Historians still argue whether the entire system functioned as intended or just masked a green-tinted racket. For you, the problem is this. You don't know which official might be nearby. Worse, they often worked in teams. A single suspicious forester could summon a verderer, and before you could say, "I was just collecting twigs," you'd find yourself in a makeshift courtroom with very few sympathies for your side of the story. Mainstream history tells us that these roles evolved over time, especially from the 12th century onward. Under Henry II and his successors, forest law grew more elaborate, more paper-heavy, and more lucrative, at least for those enforcing it. There were roles to record offenses, fines to be paid, and even rewards for catching lawbreakers. Sometimes you wonder if the whole thing was just a slow-moving money machine for the crown. Now, here's a quirky bit for your pocket. In some areas, the forest officials had the right to confiscate your cooking pot if they found venison in it. Imagine that, your only cauldron seized because you got a little too bold with the mushrooms and meat. It wasn't just the deer you'd lose dinner. And speaking of dinner, your stomach growls. You check the little pouch tied to your belt. Some blackened bread, a turnip, and a few slivers of hard cheese. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth confiscating. You hope. The wind picks up slightly and rustles the trees. You hear hooves in the distance, maybe a cart, maybe a patrol. You sink back further into the underbrush, grateful for your drab cloak. Your fingers brush against a gnarled root, damp and sticky, and you realize something else. The forest is listening, in that way old, wild places do. You start walking again, quieter now. Eyes peeled not for animals but for men with clipboards made of wax parchment. You're not just trespassing, you're navigating a web of titles and traditions. A realm where even the air seems regulated. That's the part they don't tell you in the village. That the forest isn't wild in the way you might hope. It's curated, cataloged, and slightly paranoid. There's no such thing as just a walk here. You're either legal or you're not. And most people, they're not. And yet, even with all this rule and order, the forest has an uncanny magic to it. It whispers with age. It yawns with fog. And somewhere beneath the layers of law and penalty, there's still that primal thing you came looking for. Solitude, mystery, maybe even safety. Just don't let the verdure catch you enjoying it. You push deeper into the woods, guided now by instinct more than purpose. The path isn't so much a trail as it is a suggestion, half-formed ruts, a bit of crushed fern, maybe a broken twig. The forest thickens. A tangle of bramble lashes at your tunic, and the air smells like wet bark and old stone up ahead. A clearing opens, soft underfoot with moss, scattered with toadstools that look like they should have names in Latin or possibly warnings. You pause there, momentarily free of leaves in your face, and try to get your bearings. You've been walking for hours now, dodging patrols and rules you don't fully understand, so let's step back and clarify something that would have mattered deeply to you if you'd been born into this reality. What the word forest actually meant. Because here's the twist, this wasn't really about trees. The forest of feudal England was a legal concept, not a botanical one. Could include open heathland, bogs, moors, farmland, even entire villages. If the king declared it forest, it was forest. Full stop. The trees were optional. The power, however, was not. When William the Conqueror introduced the concept from the Norman system, he wasn't aiming for conservation in the modern sense. He wanted exclusivity. Forest law created a vast parallel legal system, and it allowed the monarchy to enforce harsh penalties for acts that were otherwise perfectly legal outside the zone. You could be plowing your own field on your own land, and if it happened to be inside forest bounds, suddenly you needed permission for everything from cutting turf to grazing your ox. The rules changed the moment the designation did. Historians still argue whether this designation was meant more as a revenue source or a show of dominance. Some suggest it was largely symbolic. Others believe the king's courts enforced it rigorously, especially when money was tight or a noble needed to be reminded of their place. Your quirky tidbit of the day. In some cases, people living within a forest jurisdiction were forbidden from erecting fences around their gardens. Why? Because fencing might interfere with the passage of royal game animals. If a deer trampled your vegetables, too bad. His Majesty's venison had right of way. You move through the clearing, careful to step around a line of anthills like tiny castles. A fallen oak lies cracked open to the side, its center hollowed and steaming faintly with decay. You imagine what it must be like to live here full-time. Not as a traveler, but as a villager. Imagine waking up to the sound of hoofbeats and knowing it wasn't bandits or invading armies, but a forest official checking your firewood pile. Imagine needing permission to dig a ditch or gather berries. Imagine being fined because your dog barked at a squirrel a little too enthusiastically and the forester decided it was a chase. And the courts? Oh, the courts. We'll get to those later, don't worry. But for now, just know that the entire thing, this forest, this law, this system, was like living in a loophole that only worked for one person. The king. Now here's a nugget from the dusty scrolls of administration. The Doomsday Book, that famous medieval census commissioned by William, carefully noted which lands were under forest law and which were not. It wasn't just about land value, it was about control. And fear. And venison. The forest was essentially a patchwork monarchy within the monarchy. Not even barons or bishops were immune. In fact, many of them hated it, because even high-ranking nobles couldn't always hunt in the royal forests unless the king said so. The penalty for poaching a deer, even for someone with a title, could be brutal. Fines, yes, but also mutilation, imprisonment, exile. So who did get to hunt? Mostly the king, his family, and a few very lucky or very loyal nobles. Occasionally, knights might be given a license. But the average Joe, or even the average Sir John, wasn't automatically allowed to take aim at a stag. That privilege was guarded like a family recipe. You hear a rustle behind you, probably a badger or a night bird. But still, your heartbeat quickens. The paranoia sets in again. Not because you're afraid of the forest. No, it's beautiful. It's dreamlike. It's quiet in a way the world rarely is. But because you're always aware, the law here isn't made for you. It's made about you. You follow a stream now, letting the sound lead you forward. The moon catches the ripples in silver arcs, and your reflection glides alongside. Tired, slightly ragged, but alert. You're not here to break laws. You're just trying not to become part of someone else's fine. You think of the villagers who lived under this system day in and day out. Of the children taught not just the alphabet, but which trees were safe and which belonged to the crown. of old men who could recite the names of all the Verdeers since Henry I, of women who learned to forage only by moonlight to avoid unwanted attention, and unwanted citations. So yes, the forest was a place of beauty. But it was also a spreadsheet in disguise. A checklist of what you could do, couldn't do, and might do if no one was watching. And you're just trying to find a place to sleep where the leaves won't rat you out. The stream leads you to a bend where the trees give way to a low, marshy glade. You step lightly now, boots squelching slightly in the mossy earth, half hoping you don't disturb something or someone. Your eyes dart along the treeline. No torches, no shadows moving with unnatural rhythm. Good. You settle onto a fallen log, half dry, and take a breath. Here's where it gets truly tangled, because even if you followed every rule of the forest, unlikely, and you managed to dodge every officious verderer or sneaky forester, doubly unlikely, there was always another wrinkle waiting to trip you up. The people who ran the courts. You see, royal forests had their own entire system of justice. They operated outside of the normal legal framework. Local lords didn't hold sway. Even the usual sheriff might not have jurisdiction here. No, here you were at the mercy of a web of forest-specific officials, and their increasingly obscure courts. Take, for instance, the Court of Attachment. Sounds gentle, almost romantic. It wasn't. This court met every 40 days, mostly to record offenses and ensure accused persons were attached to appear at the next major court. Attached, in this case, didn't mean hugged warmly. It meant legally bound to show up, often under pain of serious punishment. The court didn't judge guilt or innocence. It just logged names and offenses, like an anxious scribe with a grudge. Then there was the Swain Mote. Held 3 times a year, this was where sworn forest officials, often called swains, gathered to settle minor offenses, like letting your pigs root around without permission or gathering more firewood than was strictly allowed. If you think that sounds like small potatoes, think again. Repeated violations could get you exiled or worse. But the crown jewel of woodland jurisprudence was the forest heir. This was the big one, the Grand Circuit Court held infrequently, sometimes once a decade or more. Judges would travel from forest to forest, delivering what can only be described as high-stakes woodland justice. You did not want your name on their list. Historians still argue whether these courts actually functioned well or if they were performative spectacles, designed to scare the peasantry, display royal power, and collect hefty fines. There's evidence both ways. Some heirs handed out genuine justice. Others were thinly veiled tax collection drives, cloaked in fur-lined robes and legalese. Tonight, you're lucky. No courts convening here. No one scribbling your name on a list by torchlight. But you can't help imagining it. Your simple desire to sleep under the trees spiraling into parchment records and royal seals. All because you strayed too close to a rabbit that technically belonged to the king. Here's a quirky one. In some forests, trials could take place in hollowed-out tree stumps or open-air glades. Imagine standing there, surrounded by stiff-backed men quoting Latin, while birds chirped obliviously overhead and your goat chewed on the court's makeshift bench. Not exactly the kind of legal drama you'd binge-watch, but certainly memorable. Now, if you were of a slightly higher class, say a freeman or a small landholder, you might get a bit more leeway. A fine instead of a flogging. A warning instead of a branding. But more often than not, status didn't shield you from the capricious whims of the forest courts. And remember, ignorance of the law wasn't an excuse. Not that anyone was given a helpful pamphlet or a friendly town crier listing the week's new regulations. No, the laws were often kept deliberately vague, and they shifted depending on the king's mood or the ambitions of the local warden. That firewood you collected last year without issue? Suddenly illegal this year. That glade you grazed your sheep in last spring? Now off limits, because someone redrew the map with a slightly fatter quill. You rise from the log, brushing damp bark from your sleeves, and decide to keep moving. The air is colder now, and a low fog creeps across the ground like spilled milk. You tread carefully, but your mind races with images of open-air courtrooms and scrolls filled with names like yours. The legal system of the royal forests was less about fairness and more about reinforcing hierarchy. At every level, it reminded people who the land really belonged to. Spoiler alert. Not you. Still, you can't help admiring the thoroughness of it all. There's a strange kind of beauty in how detailed the forest laws became. A world where mushroom gathering could be litigated, where pigs needed licenses, where even silence could be suspicious if it fell after a poaching arrow flew. Mainstream records from the 13th century reveal entire communities dragged into legal battles over single deer. A village could lose rights for the actions of one hunter. A monastery could be fined for planting hedges too thick for game to leap through. There were even special forest jails, yes, prisons, just for offenders caught within these leafy borders. Imagine that. Cells built beneath trees, holding men whose only crime was snaring a hare or snapping a branch, so next time you're tempted to romanticize the medieval woods as a place of noble outlaws and carefree foragers, remember this. In feudal England, the forest wasn't wild. It was administered, audited, a place of rules that watched you as closely as any city watchman, just with more moss. And still, you walk, because there's nowhere else to go tonight, and because part of you wants to see what's beyond the next rise, past the fog, through the trees. Maybe it's just another glade dot, or maybe it's freedom. The fog thickens around your ankles like a creeping tide, softening the shapes of trees until they blur into silhouettes. You walk slower now, listening to the forest breathe. Every distant creak of bark or sudden snap of a twig raises the hairs on your neck, not because you fear wolves or highwaymen, but because somewhere out there, a man with a badge and a list might be writing your name down in the margin. You spot an old wooden gate half swallowed by ivy and thyme. It swings open with a gentle groan, and you pass through into what looks like a pig meadow, though you see no pigs. Just tufts of turned earth and the telltale hoof marks of snuffling snouts. It must be panage season. Panage is one of those delightful medieval traditions that sounds like a quaint festival but was, in reality, a survival necessity and a bureaucratic nightmare if you owned pigs. And let's be honest, in your economic bracket, pigs were about the only livestock you could afford. You waited for autumn. Because once the acorns and beech mast dropped, the forest opened up for a few short weeks and let your swine run wild. The pigs loved it. You loved it. The king? He loved it, provided you paid the agister. Yes, remember the agister? The official who wandered the woods counting pigs like some medieval swine accountant? He would record who let how many pigs loose and for how long. And he would make sure you paid your fee. Skipping that fee was not only illegal, it was stupidly illegal. Mainstream sources show that entire village economies revolved around panage rights. In some regions, it was the single most important seasonal event for poorer communities. The fattening of pigs meant the difference between winter survival and grim improvisation. You didn't just eat the pork. You salted it, traded it, made sausage out of it, rendered the fat, and maybe, if the local priest was feeling indulgent, offered a bit to St. Anthony for good luck. And here's the fringe fact. In some forests, pigs had to be wrung before release. That meant having metal rings inserted into their snouts so they wouldn't root too deeply and damage the undergrowth. Forest law protected not just the deer, but the shrubs and soil as well. The trees weren't decoration, they were royal assets. And pigs were treated like little pink vandals with curly tails. Historians still argue whether this balance between royal law and local necessity was a sustainable one. Some records suggest cooperation. Others suggest tension. Many agisters were locals themselves. Men caught between serving the crown and sympathizing with neighbors. That could lead to discretion. It could also lead to favoritism, corruption, or the occasional suspiciously fat pig with no paperwork. You kneel beside a shallow hoofprint and imagine the scene here just days ago. Dozens of snorting pigs waddling between trees, kids chasing after them with sticks, and an agister watching it all with furrowed brow and a tally sheet. A sleepy woodland carnival, scented heavily with manure and roasted chestnuts. Panage season wasn't just about pigs, either. It was a time of movement. Families came deeper into the forest than usual. Temporary shelters were built. Foragers worked double time. Mushroom collecting peaked, because what went better with pork than something earthy and possibly dangerous? Of course, for every honest villager, there was always someone looking to stretch the rules. Maybe let their pigs out a few weeks early. Maybe bring a few extra, uncounted ones. Maybe accidentally snare a rabbit while searching for truffles. Slippery slope kind of stuff. Which brings us to enforcement again. Agisters didn't usually arrest people. They weren't foresters. But they could report you. They could fine you. And worst of all, they could ban you from next year's pannage. No acorns for your pigs. No pork for your winter. A social death sentence wrapped in bureaucratic language and wax seals. Still, you can't help smiling as you walk through the empty meadow. There's something endearing about pigs in the forest, isn't there? It makes the whole oppressive system seem just a little less bleak. For a few weeks each year, the forest buzzed with life and barter, with the clang of iron pots and the squeal of overeager piglets. It smelled of wood smoke and boiled apples, and for once, the fear of punishment eased. But those weeks are short. Already, the acorns have been picked clean. The ground is churned and quiet. The pigs are gone, back to their pens or onto someone's table. The Agister is probably tallying the final counts by candlelight, and the forest reclaims its silence. You pass a rusted iron post nailed into a tree, one of those old markers used to denote boundaries. It's bent and half-buried in lichen, but it reminds you, even in this moment of peace, the forest is watching. There's no escaping the layers of ownership here. Not even the pigs got to run free without filling out the medieval equivalent of Form 37B, Section 4, Subclause Oink. So you walk on, pannage behind you, the deeper woods ahead. And the feeling settles in again, that mix of awe and anxiety. You're not just in a forest. You're in a map of rules too old to be questioned and too absurd to ignore. A living law book, where every branch might be a boundary and every hoofprint a violation. But for now, at least, the pigs are gone. And no one seems to be counting you. The trees knit themselves tighter above you now, their branches like fingers interlaced in a secret. You duck beneath a low-hanging elm limb and find yourself following what looks like an old cart path, barely visible beneath the leaf litter. Ruts remain, shallow but persistent, a ghost trail of wheels long since rotted away. This, you think, is where things get truly absurd. Because you're not hunting, you're not trapping, you're not even gathering mushrooms. You're walking down what seems like a perfectly reasonable path, and that might be your next crime point, one of the lesser-known peculiarities of forest law. The concept of estover, agistment, and turbary. No, those aren't names of law firms. They're ancient rights, and you probably haven't got any of them. You see, under normal feudal custom, common folk had certain rights of the common that allowed them to gather what they needed from shared lands. Firewood, peat, bracken, grazing. But in a royal forest, those rights evaporated unless specifically granted. You couldn't just pick up dead wood to keep your cottage warm. That could be classified as theft. You couldn't cut turf to burn. You couldn't collect brush for thatching. Even gathering ferns could be suspect, because if it grew in the forest, it might be vert, a term that referred not only to trees, but to undergrowth protected under forest law. Let that sink in. Shrubs could be illegal. Now, mainstream sources describe countless cases where people were dragged into forest court for something as trivial as breaking branches for cart repair. A snapped stick was evidence. A single load of firewood could become Exhibit A. People paid fines. Others faced imprisonment. The most stubborn or desperate might lose a hand. And here's your quirky tidbit. Even the carts themselves could be evidence of guilt. In some places, if you were found with unlicensed timber, the cart and the oxen pulling it could be confiscated. Not just the wood, the whole setup. One moment you're hauling logs home, the next you're walking back with empty arms and a strong opinion about royal forestry. Historians still argue whether these laws were enforced as harshly as the records suggest. Some believe they were symbolic tools of control more than consistent practice. Others point to local records where dozens of people were prosecuted in a single day for firewood offenses. Either way, it meant one thing for the average person: paranoia. You crouch by the old ruts and run your hand through the leaves. They're wet and heavy with yesterday's rain. Beneath them, the faint glint of an old iron nail, maybe from a broken cart. You wonder about the last person who traveled this road. A charcoal burner? A woodcutter with too much ambition? A forester's cousin who thought he could get away with something? The wind picks up and scatters a few loose leaves. You pull your cloak tighter and move on, more cautious now, because it's not just what you take that gets you in trouble, it's how you take it. Even carrying wood in the wrong way could raise suspicion. There were rules about how much you could carry on your back versus how much you needed a license for if it was in a cart. Certain areas allowed for hook and crook gathering, a quaint phrase that meant collecting only what you could carry by hand or with a small tool. Anything beyond that, and the assumption was, you were stealing from the king. Yes, even twigs could be contraband. Let's say you need to repair your thatch. A few bundles of brush should do it. You take a walk, gather what seems like abandoned debris, and start back. And then, surprise! A forester on patrol. He inspects your bundle, scowls at your improvised twine, and cites you for unlawful removal of vert. You protest. He shrugs. The law is the law. You'll be summoned to the court of attachment in 40 days. Bring a witness if you can find one who wasn't also carrying twigs. And if you were really unlucky, you might get slapped with an ancient rule about breaking the soil without permission. Even dragging a stick that plowed the earth slightly might be argued as unlawful cultivation. It sounds ridiculous now. It sounded slightly less ridiculous back then. The deeper irony? This wasn't about protecting nature. It was about protecting privilege. Forest law wasn't environmentalism, it was exclusivism. The deer and the trees weren't sacred. They were symbolic. If the king controlled the woods, he controlled you. And so you tread carefully, watching where your boots land and what your hands brush against. You find yourself avoiding anything that looks even mildly useful. The temptation to pick up a solid branch for a walking stick is strong, but you leave it. You're not about to risk becoming part of someone's case file over a bit of kindling. It's quiet now. So quiet you can hear the rustle of a mole beneath the leaf litter. Somewhere, an owl hoots again, same one as before, probably just showing off. The path opens slightly, leading toward a patch of younger saplings planted in an unusually straight row. Managed woodland, you realize. Someone cared enough to grow these in formation. For fuel? For fence posts? For sale? Doesn't matter. Touching them is off limits. You step off the path, not wanting to leave tracks near the saplings. The irony is thick. There's no fence, no sign, no guard. Just the ghost of law, whispering through the branches, reminding you that even without eyes on you, you're not truly free here. And yet, it's beautiful. Even now, with rules swirling like leaves around your every move, the forest sings. Not with birdsong, though there's some of that too, but with age. With memory. With the layered absurdity of a world where firewood was illegal but branding someone for it was fine. You press forward. The cart path fades, and the wildness returns. You're tired, but alert. Careful, but curious. You're in the king's woods, yes. But for now, you're your own guide. Your boots crunch gently over the forest floor as you descend a slope so gentle it feels like a lull. The trees here are older. Great boles of beech and ash, gnarled and stoic, standing sentinel over centuries of quiet mischief. There's a mossy stillness in the air, as if even the birds have decided not to interrupt this part of the woods. You pause by a shallow stream. Its waters run clear over rounded stones, trickling past as though indifferent to human history. You dip your fingers in, just to feel something that isn't woven with rules. But even this moment has a catch. Did you just disturb a royal fish? Because believe it or not, there were fish crimes too. We'll get to that later. For now, let's talk about what made the forest worth all this legal acrobatics to begin with. Deer, you sigh. Majestic, yes, but more importantly, legally explosive. You see, in the eyes of the king and his officials, deer weren't just animals, they were mobile treasure chests. They were royal property, often described in legal documents with phrases like beasts of the forest. The big three: red deer, fallow deer, and roe deer. Killing one of them without royal permission was more than poaching. It was an insult to the throne itself. Mainstream records show deer were essentially treated like living, breathing currency. Gifts of venison were handed out to curry political favor. A few legs of deer meat could smooth over a noble's grudge, or at least delay it until spring. A whole stag? That could be a wedding present or a thank you for murdering someone on the right side of a land dispute. And here's a quirky one. Certain royal feasts required venison to be prepared in ludicrously specific ways. Soaked in wine, studded with cloves, or even perfumed with flowers. Not exactly peasant fare. The deer wasn't just for eating. It was for display. A meal and a message. So when a peasant strung a bough in the shadows and let an arrow fly, it wasn't just about feeding his family. It was considered a symbolic rebellion, even if no one said it out loud. Historians still argue whether most deer poaching was out of desperation or defiance. Some view poachers as Robin Hood figures, heroes striking back at an unjust system. Others say they were just hungry folks gambling with their lives. Probably a bit of both, depending on the moon and the mood and the winter ahead. And yes, there were punishments. Oh, the punishments. You couldn't legally kill a deer. You couldn't wound one. You couldn't even chase one. In some areas, you weren't even allowed to look like you might chase one. Carrying a bow in a royal forest could be enough for a court summons. Same with arrows, especially if they were broad-headed. A type particularly suited to bringing down large animals. You cross the stream carefully, hopping from one mossy stone to the next. Every splash feels louder than it should. You check behind you. Nothing. Just your own footprints fading back into fern. Now imagine being caught with deer meat. Not just any meat, venison. You've cooked it, or tried to. Maybe you salted it and hid it under your floorboards. Maybe you gave some to your cousin. Doesn't matter. If someone tells the local forester, and they often did, you were in for a world of parchment and pain. At T minimum, you'd pay a fine. At worst, mutilation, branding, imprisonment, maybe even execution, especially in the early days of Norman rule when the system was still sharpest. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. Some medieval officials believed deer had a kind of spiritual significance, an echo of older pagan beliefs, perhaps. There are records of deer being buried with small tokens or prayers. Others considered them lucky omens. Unless, of course, you were caught with one. Then they were just very expensive ghosts. You stop by a fallen tree and sit, not because you need the rest but because the weight of rules is heavy tonight. You think about how many lives were quietly ruined over a meal. How many families lost their only pig because someone took a bite out of the wrong kind of stew. How many forests weren't places of freedom, but of fear, wrapped in bark and bureaucracy. And yet, the deer still roam. You hear one now, maybe off in the distance. A faint rustle, a shifting of undergrowth too precise to be the wind. You don't turn your head. You just smile a little. They're still out here, those velvet-crowned rebels. Still leaping fences, still munching forbidden leaves, still outrunning the invisible ink of forest law. You wonder what it's like to be a deer in a royal forest. Protected and hunted all at once. Sacred and delicious. A creature that could send a man to prison just by existing too closely. There's a strange peace in that. A strange irony, too. That in a forest crawling with officials and legalese, the deer get to wander freely. You envy them, just a little. You rise from the log and stretch, cracking your back against the chill. The stream behind you burbles without comment. The stars overhead begin to poke through the canopy in cold, sleepy clusters. Somewhere, another deer steps quietly through the brush and lives to see another moon. For now. You move slowly now, eyes scanning the underbrush, half expecting to see a pair of eyes staring back. Glassy and wide, deer or otherwise. But the forest remains hush-hush. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. You climb a gentle rise, your boots snagging in tangled roots, until the trees part just enough to reveal a small clearing. You pause. You can almost hear a horn. Not a modern one. No cars coming to rescue you. This is the long, low call of a hunting horn. One that would have echoed over these trees 800 years ago, bouncing between branches and alerting everyone for miles that the real entertainment was about to begin. Because, you see, when the nobility hunted, it wasn't just a casual trot through the woods. It was a full-blown spectacle. An event. A carefully choreographed dance of horses, hounds, hawks, horns, and hierarchy. A knight's right to hunt wasn't just about meat. It was about proving their place in the social food chain. Let's be clear. You didn't just decide to hunt. You had to be allowed. That meant status, titles, and, more importantly, royal permission. Even many knights couldn't hunt in the royal forests unless they held a specific license. These licenses were highly regulated, often expensive, and not always honored between reigns. You might be a celebrated warrior, but if you took down a stag in the wrong glade, you were still a criminal. Mainstream historians note that hunting was one of the key ways the aristocracy distinguished itself from commoners. It wasn't just a hobby. It was a ritual of control, grace, and blood. Kings like Henry II and Richard the Lionheart were obsessed with hunting, considering it both a spiritual cleansing and a military workout. Chase the deer, chase your sins, or your enemies, so the forest became a kind of stage. Imagine the scene. Silks and satins, cloaks and feathered caps, noble women perched on palfreys watching from the sidelines, hawks tethered to gloved arms, hunting dogs braying in anticipation. The nobleman lifts his horn, lets out a single long note, and the chase begins. If you happen to be a peasant nearby, you ducked. Because while the nobles had rights, you had obligations. You might be roped into helping, beating the bushes, carrying the gear, tending to wounded hounds. And if you did it wrong, fined. Or worse, if you interfered, heaven help you. Tripping a noble's horse, however accidentally, could send you straight to the forest court, where sympathy came with a surcharge. Here's a quirky nugget. Some nobles employed professional deer finders. Basically, guys who spent their lives tracking the movements of specific animals so the hunt could feel natural while being choreographed down to the final leap. It was less wilderness adventure and more medieval version of a guided fishing trip with a lot more velvet. And the terminology. Goodness. A group of deer? That's a herd. A group of nobles on horseback? That's a quarrel waiting to happen. But officially, a hunt or a field. The terms for deer varied too, depending on age, sex, and royal mood. They were called harts, hinds, stags, or beasts of venery. There was even a distinct etiquette for what you called the animal after it was killed. Yes, even the vocabulary was elitist. Historians still debate how much of the royal forest was used for these formal hunts versus just being held as symbolic territory. Some believe only a fraction was actually ridden through regularly. Others argue the mere idea of the hunt, its possibility, was enough to justify the laws, the restrictions, and the absurd level of oversight. You stand in the clearing a while longer, trying to picture it. A bright, crisp morning, the ground slick with dew, horses stamping and steaming, nobles shouting in Norman French, dogs snapping at their leashes. A deer bolts, the forest erupts in motion, and somewhere behind them all, a peasant girl drops her bucket of water and quietly curses the king under her breath. That it wasn't just a hunt. It was a hierarchy in motion, everyone in their place. The deer, the dogs, the nobles, and the peasants. Each running their part in the royal theater. You imagine slipping in unnoticed, maybe with a hood pulled low and a bow wrapped in rags. You wouldn't get far. Not because you're not clever, but because someone's always watching. A hidden lookout, a keen-eyed page, a hound that remembers your scent. One wrong step and you're no longer in the audience. You're the story. The nobleman returns, horn slung lazily over his back, deer carcass strapped to a pony. You, meanwhile, scurry back to your hut, hoping the smell of meat on the wind doesn't give you away. Because this wasn't your right, it was theirs. And yet the forest remembers you. Not the nobleman, not the pageantry, but the way you moved silently through the bracken. The way your feet knew the path without needing stone markers. The way you didn't need a horn to know when the deer were close. You leave the clearing quietly, your own hunt less dramatic. Just for a dry place to rest. Maybe a hollow in a tree. Maybe a patch of ground that won't betray you. Somewhere far behind you, a stag bolts, and you let it go. You drift deeper into the woods now, footsteps quiet on the thick cushion of fallen leaves. The night is darker than before, the trees packed tighter, and the air cooler, soaked in the kind of dampness that clings to your skin like a slow regret. You adjust your cloak and continue forward, guided only by starlight filtered through ragged branches. A smell hits your nose. Not rot, not damp wood, meat, cooked meat. Somewhere nearby, someone's broken the rules. You drop low, instinctively. A flicker of orange dances ahead. Firelight, barely visible through the bracken. You crawl closer, and there it is, a crude spit over a bed of coals. And on that spit, venison. This isn't just a quiet dinner, it's a scandal. You watch from behind a tree as two figures sit beside the fire, their voices low. No uniforms, no crests, just ragged clothes, patchy cloaks, and the unmistakable caution of men doing something they shouldn't. They're poachers, and they're playing the most dangerous game in the forest. Poaching was the great sin of the royal forest. If you did it, you knew the risks. But you might do it anyway because if your family hadn't eaten in days, a deer meant life. Even a rabbit meant survival. And for some, poaching was less about desperation and more about rebellion. Mainstream history confirms that poaching was often a mix of both. There were the hungry villagers, the opportunistic tanners, the outlaws turned butchers. And then there were the career poachers, skilled hunters who knew how to work a snare, where to wait for the herd, how to move without snapping a twig. These men weren't fools. They were tacticians. They'd study the habits of the local verdeers. They knew when patrols changed shifts. They greased the right palms. And when caught, they had their stories ready. I thought it was a fox. Or I only found it dead. Or my dog brought it back. I didn't shoot it. But the courts weren't big on nuance. Forest law saw poaching as a betrayal of royal authority. Not just a theft of meat, but a theft of power. And the punishments were designed accordingly. First offense? Maybe a fine if you were lucky. Second? Branding, often on the cheek or thumb. Third? Well, let's just say you wouldn't be drawing a bow again. There's a strange irony here. The same deer that pranced around untouched under royal protection became a blood-soaked symbol the moment an arrow flew from the wrong hands. A noble could kill a dozen in a day, call it sport, and hand out the meat like party favors. But a villager? One deer, and they were branded for life. Literally. Here's a quirky tidbit for your fireside consideration. Some towns had informal networks where poached venison was quietly redistributed. The meat would be salted, wrapped in cloth, and passed down alleys and through kitchen windows. It became an underground economy. Poachers were heroes in some villages. Providers. Sometimes they were even protected, hidden by families, helped by clergy. Historians still argue whether this network was widespread or romanticized. Some say it was occasional, driven by hardship. Others argue entire communities were complicit, sharing meat in quiet defiance of the law. You lie still, the firelight painting shadows across your face. The smell is maddening, smoky, rich, oily in a way only forbidden food can be. You wonder what it would take to step into that circle, to share that meat, to gamble your future on a moment of warmth. But you don't move, because you've seen what happens to those who get caught. And besides, poaching isn't just about the hunt, it's about everything that comes after. The silence, the secrecy. The moment you realize that firelight can't hide you forever. One of the poachers stirs. He says something about the meat being too lean, that the king's deer don't taste half as good as the village ones. The other laughs quietly. They both seem nervous. They know they're pushing their luck. But luck is all they've got. You slip away, careful not to snap a twig. You leave them to their meal, their fire, and their unspoken dread that as you walk, the smell fades behind you. But the idea lingers. That meat could mean a warm winter. Could also mean the end of your freedom. The line between outlaw and provider was razor-thin in the forest. One snare, one arrow, one meal. And yet, the poachers return. Night after night. Because law doesn't fill your belly. Rules don't warm your children. And no one ever traded a royal pardon for a stew bone. You walk on, stomach growling, mind spinning. In the forest, the deer run. And so do the men who dare to follow. But only one gets to sleep without looking over their shoulder. The firelight behind you dims with distance, swallowed once again by the underbrush and thickening dark. You walk in silence, more careful now, acutely aware that at any moment you could stumble across something or someone that turns this quiet stroll into a courtroom prelude. The path winds uphill, steep enough to make your legs ache, and soon you find yourself on a ridge with a view. Treetops undulating like waves, moonlight pooled in the valleys, mist curling lazily in the hollows, peaceful, almost. But below that beauty, a different story roils, one of fear, fines, and frequently broken rules. Because while poachers risked the noose, there were others who lived in the forest, because of the noose, outlaws. Not the romantic kind with feathered caps and cryptic riddles. No, these were men and women who'd been declared outside the law, stripped of protection, and cast into the wilderness. And where did they go when the village gates closed behind them? They came here. To the Greenwood. the tangled haven of the desperate, the exiled, and the inconvenient. You crouch at the ridge's edge, eyes scanning the thickets below. If you were lucky, you might find an outlaw camp. If you were unlucky, they might find you first. Mainstream records from the 12th and 13th centuries show a rise in people using royal forests as hiding places. Not just for poachers, but for criminals, political dissidents, even debtors. The law called them fugitivi forestae, fugitives of the forest. Once you were declared caput lupinum, wolf's head, you were fair game. Anyone could kill you without legal consequence. No trial, no blood money. You were no longer a person. You were prey. And here's the chilling part. In the forest, you blended in. Because who would know? Who would tell? The verdeers couldn't patrol every glade. The foresters couldn't be everywhere at once. If you kept to the shadows, moved at night, and stayed quiet, you could survive. Maybe even build something. A camp. A life. A second chance. There's a quirky fringe tale about a man known only as Old Dunstan, an outlaw who supposedly lived 30 years beneath the same overturned tree near Sherwood Forest. He carved charms from yew wood and traded owl feathers for bread. Some said he spoke to deer. Others said he was one. Historians still argue whether the forest was truly a haven for outlaws or just a last resort. The terrain was brutal, the laws worse, and while legends like Robin Hood paint a merry life of song and redistributive justice, reality was far more moldy. You spent your days damp, cold, and hunted, not by sheriffs with clear motives, but by starvation and exposure. Yet many chose it. Better the silence of the woods than the clanging of chains. Better the risk of wolves, real or legal, than the certainty of a gibbet. Some even turned outlaw by choice, rebelling against corrupt officials or unjust taxes. They slipped into the forest and began to haunt it, turning knowledge of the terrain into currency, and fear into a kind of freedom. You descend the ridge now, cautious. A snapped twig here, a shifted stone there. Were they signs of someone else's passage? Or just your nerves speaking in footsteps? The forest plays tricks. You reach a thicket of holly and worm your way through, thorns scraping your sleeves. Beyond lies a hollow, scooped from the earth like a forgotten basin. And there, barely visible in the moonlight, is what might have been a camp. No tents, no fires, just impressions in the leaf mold, shapes where bodies once curled for sleep. A pile of stones that might have formed a makeshift hearth. A strip of cloth snagged on a branch, fluttering like a flag of silence. They were here, and they left no names behind. You sit for a moment on one of the stones. Try to imagine it. A circle of voices, low and wary. Men comparing finds like battle scars. Women cradling stolen turnips like treasure. A child poking at embers, unaware that this cold, quiet corner of the world is a sanctuary bought at great cost. No laws reach here. And no laws protect you. This, too, was the forest. Not just a preserve for nobles, not just a trap for peasants, but a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. And while the crown declared these people criminals, the trees made no such distinction. They offered shelter to all. Moss grows for kings and thieves alike. Rain falls without hierarchy. And the roots don't care if your hands are branded. Still, you don't linger. There's something sacred about an empty camp. You rise, brushing dirt from your legs, and step lightly through the hollow, careful not to disturb what remains. These were not your laws, and this was not your story. But tonight you walk the same path. Quiet, unseen. A shadow beneath the branches. The forest is thicker now, almost claustrophobic. Branches reach out like arms, tugging at your sleeves, brushing your face, whispering things in a language only old trees know. Every step feels more secret, more sacred, and more risky. You're not just walking anymore. You're trespassing in a story much older than you. Because the Greenwood has a strange relationship with the law. On one hand, it's where the law is sharpest, where rules are etched not just in parchment, but into tree trunks and fence lines and your very footsteps. But on the other hand, it's where the law ends. Or at least, where it starts to blur. You step over a fallen log and find yourself in a wide dell, ringed with yews and elder trees. The air is still, too still. This is the kind of place where a man might vanish and become a tale, or where a tail might slip out of the trees and borrow your name. This is sanctuary. Well, you've probably heard the term before, sanctuary. The idea that a church or sacred space could protect someone from arrest, at least temporarily. In medieval England, sanctuary wasn't just a concept. It was law. If you were being chased, you could sprint for the nearest church, grip the door ring, and claim asylum. For 40 days, you were untouchable. But what about the forest? It wasn't consecrated. There were no altar rails or chanting monks. But still, for centuries, outlaws and fugitives sought sanctuary here, in the dense, wild pockets of England's woodlands. It was unofficial, sure, illegal even, but it worked. Sometimes. Especially in the deeper parts. Especially when the foresters were lazy, or bribable, or sympathetic. Mainstream legal records show cases where royal officials refused to pursue fugitives into certain forest areas, not because they were afraid, but because it was seen as bad optics. The crown had a vested interest in maintaining order, but not necessarily in chasing every ragged runaway into a tangle of thorns. And here's your fringe fact. In some folk traditions, specific trees, especially yews and oaks, were believed to offer natural sanctuary. If you touched one, if you curled beneath its roots, the spirits of the forest would hide you. These weren't church laws. These were older laws. The kind whispered over firelight, passed down in lullabies and old women's warnings. Historians still argue whether this belief in forest sanctuary was based on pagan tradition, Christian misinterpretation, or just good old-fashioned desperation. The result, though, was real. People hid in trees, slept beneath them, wrote charms in charcoal on bark. Some swore that as long as they stayed within certain groves, they couldn't be caught. Of course, that didn't stop the law from trying. Special forest pursuits were occasionally launched. Armed parties of officials sweeping through the underbrush, sniffing out fugitives like hounds. But these raids were expensive, dangerous, and often fruitless. The forest didn't give up its guests easily, especially when the guests had friends, hiding places, and a very good reason not to be found. You lean against the trunk of an ancient yew, the bark smooth and oddly warm beneath your hand. You wonder how many other fugitives have rested here, how many secrets the tree holds in its rings. You're not guilty of anything, not really, but still, you feel like you're part of that lineage now. One more shadow in the forest's long memory. You take a moment to rest. Not just your legs, but your mind. Because out here, it's not just your body that's tired. It's your watchfulness, the endless checking, the constant calculation of noise and visibility and risk. You can't sleep yet, but you close your eyes for a second, just to listen. The forest breathes around you. A twig snaps in the distance, but you don't move. It might be a deer, might be a rabbit, might be someone like you, hoping this old dell still remembers how to hide people. Or maybe it's the forest itself, settling into its roots, curling back into its ancient rituals, because out here the lines blur. The law is strong, yes, but so is the forest's indifference to it shelters who it will. It swallows what it must. And if you're quiet, respectful, and lucky, it might just forget to report you. You leave the dell behind, stepping carefully over tangled roots and ducking beneath a curtain of ivy that hangs from a crooked ash like a veil. The sense of sanctuary lingers, like smoke in your clothes after a fire, but so does the tension. The deeper you go, the more the forest seems to test you. And soon you begin to wonder, what if the most famous outlaw of all wasn't a rebel at all, but a legal headache? Robin Hood. You know the story. The green tights, the band of merry men, stealing from the rich, giving to the poor, archery contests, daring escapes, romantic strolls with Maid Marian. It's bedtime legend, folk hero folklore, and a lawyer's worst nightmare. But let's take a quieter step through this tale, shall we? One where we don't follow the ballads, but the court records, the scrolls, the parchment trails left behind by exasperated officials and half-amused scribes. Because while Robin Hood is a story, he's also a symptom, a forest law, of its absurdities, of its enemies, and of the very real people who lived inside its leafy cage and decided not to play along. Mainstream historians have identified dozens of candidates who may have inspired the Robin Hood myth, real men named Robert or Robin Hod or Hood, scattered across court records from the 13th and 14th centuries. Most of them, fugitives. forest dwellers, poachers, occasionally local heroes, usually legal nuisances. And here's a quirky twist. In some court records, Robin Hood becomes a placeholder, a kind of stand-in for troublemakers who couldn't be caught. It's like writing John Doe, but for someone who's probably hiding in a tree with a bow and a sack of salted venison. 1 13th century Yorkshire roll even lists Robin Hood as someone not found, meaning the court knew he existed, had probably dealt with him before, but couldn't quite catch him this time. Classic Robin. And what exactly was he doing? Poaching, mostly. Sometimes robbery. Sometimes just existing where the king said he shouldn't. You see, in the royal forest, existence itself could become resistance. If you cooked without permission, built a shelter without leave, or walked with a bough over your shoulder, you weren't just living, you were breaking things. Laws. Norms. Patience. So Robin Hood becomes not just a character, but a concept. The one who said no. Or maybe not even no. Just maybe later. He's not the loud revolutionary. He's the quiet, constant irritation. The deer that keeps escaping. The poacher who never shows up to court. The outlaw whose arrows never quite miss the mark, even when aimed at power. Historians still argue whether he was ever real. Some think he was entirely fictional, a patchwork of stories sewn together like a worn green cloak. Others insist there must have been someone, some spark in the dark. But what matters isn't whether he existed. It's that the forest made him possible. Without the thicket of laws, without the fines and mutilations, without the absurd, sprawling network of royal oversight, there would have been no reason for Robin Hood to matter, or to run. You pass an old tree that might have once held a rope swing or a noose. The bark is scarred in a long vertical streak, as if some ancient blade tried to carve out a confession and gave up halfway. You imagine Robin passing this tree, not with a smirk or a joke, but with a glance. He's not trying to be a hero. He's just hungry, just cold, just tired of pretending that the king owns everything. And in that quiet frustration, he becomes something else. A shadow, a whisper, a reason for a child to smile when someone tells them you can fight back. Even if all you have is a bough, a friend, and a good hiding place, you move on, boots rustling in leaves, cloak snagging on the occasional thorn. You think of the other merry men, Little John, Will Scarlet, Friar Tuck. Were they real? Possibly. Probably not altogether. But certainly, someone laughed too loudly around a poacher's fire and got remembered wrong. And Maid Marian? Maybe she was the only one with any sense, staying in town while the boys argued over deer liver and curfews. You chuckle softly. Because in the end, Robin Hood isn't here to save you. He's here to remind you that rules only hold when people agree to be ruled. The royal forests were supposed to be closed, protected, controlled. But the forest itself never obeyed. Trees grew where they wanted. Deer leapt fences. And people like Robin, they slipped through gaps like mist. So maybe, just maybe, you're not breaking the rules. Maybe you're walking the old paths, the ones carved by those who refuse to play by laws written in ink but never in bark. You stop at a clearing lit with moonlight and swear you hear something, not a voice, not a song. Just the soft snap of a branch and the feeling that somewhere nearby, someone is smiling in the dark. You don't look back, because if Robin Hood is real, he's already gone. Morning comes slowly, the way it always does in the forest. Like it's not entirely sure it's welcome. The sun doesn't rise so much as seep through the branches, golden syrup dripping between limbs, casting streaks of light across the forest floor. The damp clings to everything, and your cloak smells of bark, earth, and a trace of wood smoke that isn't yours. You stretch stiff limbs beneath a thick beech and shake out the cold. You didn't sleep, not really. You drifted in and out, one ear always tuned to the woods, waiting for footsteps or hoofbeats or the rustle of parchment, looking for a name to find. But the forest stayed quiet, too quiet. Maybe you decide to move on. A small track leads you past a dry streambed and a patch of bracken chewed low. Deer, likely. Or pigs, if someone's testing the patience of the Agister again. And that's when you spot it. A set of boot prints. Deep, deliberate, and recent. Not yours. Not a poacher's either, unless they've taken to wearing polished leather and walking like they own the place. Someone official has been here. And that brings us to the other side of forest law. Because for every hungry poacher or romantic outlaw, There's always someone enforcing the rules, and breaking them too. Let's talk about foresters behaving badly. You might assume the forest officials, those guardians of royal venison and sacred moss, were paragons of duty, dutiful, disciplined, honest to the core. You'd be wrong. Mainstream records show a surprising number of cases involving forest officials who, shall we say, misunderstood their job description. Foresters who ignored poaching in exchange for favors. Verdeers who falsified reports to avoid difficult cases. Agisters who invented extra pigs to justify higher fees. The king's forest wasn't just a legal system, it was an economy. And like all economies, it had its hustlers. There's one lovely example from the Pipe Rolls, a set of medieval financial records, where a royal warden was fined for having illegally sold deadwood by the cartload from a forest near Gloucester. Not just a few branches here and there. He was running a side business, with volume discounts. And here's your quirky tidbit for the day. In some cases, foresters kept private hunting dogs and staged their own little hunts, under cover of darkness. They'd gather friends, sneak out, and do exactly what they fined others for doing. Just in nicer boots and with better ale. Of course, the crown occasionally cracked down, but usually only when someone important complained, or when corruption interfered with the king's own deer sausage supply. Petty bribes? Ignored. Local favoritism? Tolerated. But steal from the crown itself? That's when things got unpleasant. Historians still argue whether this corruption was baked into the system or just a byproduct of poor oversight. The truth is probably both. The forest was vast, under-patrolled, and riddled with local loyalties. A verdeer might share a godparent with a known poacher. A warden might owe his cousin for a favor. And once a forest fine was collected, who could say where the money actually went? You follow the bootprints, cautious. Not because you're afraid of the official, but because you know how these things go. If they want to catch you doing something illegal, they will. If they can't find a reason, they'll make one. And if you ask questions, they'll add disrespect to your list of crimes. You step lightly over a patch of nettles and find a small stone boundary marker, one of the old ones, inscribed with initials barely legible. It marks the corner of a parcel once disputed between two barons. You remember the tale. One accused the other of moving the marker 20 feet during a thunderstorm. They fought a duel. Neither could remember where it started. And while the barons fenced and fumed, the local forester sold firewood from both sides of the line. Efficient. There's a strange power in being the one who interprets the law. A verdeer could decide whether your firewood collection was harmless or theft. An agister could claim your pigs were undercounted. A warden could forget he saw your bow, so long as you forgot you saw him selling kindling behind the chapel. This wasn't always malicious. Sometimes it was just survival. The salaries for forest officials were low, the expectations high, and the opportunities for extra earnings too tempting to resist. You reach a ridge and spot a glint through the trees. A badge? A buckle? No, just dew on a fern. Still, your pulse rises, because even if the foresters were crooked, they still had power. They were the law, and in the forest, the law had a long memory and a short fuse. You keep walking, careful not to leave footprints, careful not to carry anything that could look useful, because out here, guilt isn't proven. It's assumed, and innocence is just a lack of evidence, until someone with a seal and a scroll decides otherwise. Still, it's hard not to smile, because somewhere out here, there's a forester with venison breath and charcoal on his boots, pretending to be pure as snow. And you're the one they'd accuse of wrongdoing. But the forest knows better. It remembers who treads lightly, who leaves no scars, who treats even the smallest stick with respect. And maybe, just maybe, it's starting to take your side. You move on from the ridge, descending into a shallow vale where the mist pools thick and white, rising in tendrils that cling to your boots and ankles like sleepy ghosts. The silence deepens. There's a hush here, not of danger, but of memory. Because in this part of the forest, something once changed. You don't see it at first, but then you spot the stone. A squat, weather-worn block set half into the earth, carved faintly into its surface. A symbol part crown, part tree, barely legible after centuries of wind and rain. It's a charter stone, or rather, a remnant of what once was. This is where the forest laws were briefly challenged. Let's talk about the Charter of the Forest. You've heard of Magna Carta, of course, that famous 1215 agreement between King John and his rebellious barons. Liberty, rights, the start of English common law. Yes, yes. But lost in the fanfare is its quieter cousin, the Carta de Foresta, the Charter of the Forest, issued just 2 years later in 1217. While Magna Carta dealt with barons and taxes and grand ideas about justice, the Charter of the Forest did something far more practical. It gave poor people back their woods. Or at least a little bit. Under King John, forest law had reached peak absurdity. Whole swaths of England had been declared royal forest. Up to a third of the country. That meant no gathering firewood, no grazing, no pigs, no mushrooms, no fishing, no hunting. Unless, of course, you were a friend of the crown. And people were tired of it. So when John died and his son Henry III inherited the mess, the barons and bishops forced a compromise. The Charter of the Forest rolled back some of the king's most egregious claims. It restored certain rights to free men. It reduced the boundaries of royal forests. It even promised that no man would lose life or limb for hunting a deer. Imagine that. Deer crimes downgraded from mutilation to don't do that again. Mainstream historians hail it as one of the earliest environmental justice documents. Not because it saved trees, but because it acknowledged that people lived here too. That survival sometimes trumps symbolism. That the bramble you're sleeping under might be sacred, but it's also the only roof you've got. Here's your quirky tidbit. The Charter of the Forest remained law in England for centuries. Longer, in fact, than Magna Carta. While the latter was rewritten, redacted, and rendered symbolic, the Forest Charter stuck around in legal form until the 1970s. That's right, 1971, when it was finally repealed. Which means that, until fairly recently, the ancient rights of pannage, estover, and agistment were still technically part of English law. Of course, few people remembered. Fewer still invoked it. But it was there. Like the stone beneath your feet. Quiet. Forgotten. But not gone. You kneel beside the stone now and trace the groove of the old crown carved into it. Your fingers come away stained with moss. You wonder who set it here. A clerk? A knight? A village elder with a mule and a chisel? You wonder what it meant to the people then, to feel the forest shift. Not physically, but legally. To wake up one morning and find that the tree you'd always feared was no longer off-limits. That the bracken you tiptoed around could now fill your mattress. That your pig, bless her greedy snout, was finally allowed to eat the acorns you'd been staring at all autumn. Historians still argue whether the Charter of the Forest actually worked. Some say the boundaries were rolled back on paper but not in practice. Others point to royal commissions, remappings, and testimonies that suggest a real, if slow, shift. People did gain back some access. The law did ease, at least for a time. You stand again, brushing the damp from your knees. The mist is thinning. Light filters through the trees like soft thread. It's a new day, and the forest doesn't feel quite as heavy. That's the strange thing about law. It changes not with thunderclaps, but with signatures. Quiet scribbles that make loud differences. One charter, a few lines of Latin, and suddenly, the forest isn't just a cage. It's something you can live in again. You walk on, past the stone, letting it disappear behind you. You don't need a monument to tell you what the forest remembers. It was here before kings. It will be here after. But for a brief moment in 1217, the people stood their ground and the trees listened. The morning mist finally lifts, giving way to clearer air and the comforting creak of branches stretching toward a pale sky. Sunlight dabs itself lazily across the ferns, and for a moment, you could almost believe the forest has softened. Almost. But then, in a quiet clearing ahead, you hear voices, high-pitched and hushed. You crouch low, stepping silently behind a thick hawthorn bush, and peer through the branches. Three figures, women, from the look of them. One stooped with age, another no older than a teenager, and the third carrying a wicker basket full of something. You can't see exactly what, but their backs are bent with familiarity, not fear. They're not lost. They belong here. And suddenly, you're reminded this story isn't all deer and noblemen and overzealous verdairs. The forest wasn't just a battleground for poachers and kings. It was a world of women, too. Quiet, resourceful, and far more involved than the usual tales suggest. You ease back into the shadows and listen. women in the medieval forest played complicated roles. They weren't just background figures collecting herbs in storybook illustrations. They were active participants in woodland life, sometimes legally, often quietly, always carefully. Some were gatherers, of fuel, of berries, of bark and mushrooms. Others were charcoal burners, pig keepers, weavers of rushes, or even unofficial herbalists. A few were poachers. A few more were lookouts. Many were none of these things at all, but they knew who was. Under forest law, women were not excluded, but their offenses were often treated differently. Sometimes more leniently, sometimes not. A woman caught stealing firewood might be fined less than a man, or she might be shamed publicly, marched through the village with stolen branches tied to her back. It depended less on the crime than on who caught her. Mainstream legal records show women frequently appearing in forest court roles, usually for small infractions. Gathering green wood, allowing their pigs to graze without permission, trespassing into areas marked close vert. One record from the late 1200s notes a widow fined 3 pence for collecting windfall branches, sticks already on the ground. A trivial act. A legal offense. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some forest courts actually excused women from appearing at all, as long as their husbands showed up to pay the fine. Convenient? Perhaps. Patronizing? Absolutely. But it also created a loophole. Unmarried or widowed women sometimes got away with more, simply because no one wanted the paperwork. Historians still argue whether women's participation in forest economies was underestimated or simply undocumented. The truth, most likely, lies in the rustle of aprons gathering herbs, the quiet tapping of knives trimming branches, the whispered names of plants passed down through generations. You watch as the youngest woman holds up a mushroom to the light, squints at its underside, then nods. The elder gestures either an approval or a warning, and the girl tucks it into the basket. Another lesson, another recipe, another rule to remember. They move slowly but with purpose, mapping the forest not by law but by memory. They know where the best nettles grow, where the bees hum lazily around the hollow tree, where the stream floods in spring and leaves silt behind that's good for soap. They don't wear badges. They don't carry bows. But make no mistake, they know this forest better than the wardens ever will. You wonder what it was like for them, living under forest law. How many permissions they had to request. How many favors they owed to keep their routines going unnoticed. Did they trade secrets with the foresters? Were they ever called to court? Did they ever laugh at the absurdity of needing royal approval to pick a bramble? Probably. Because survival has a sense of humor, especially when the system doesn't. You shift slightly, a twig snapping beneath your heel. The women freeze. For a tense second, no one moves. You hold your breath. One of them glances toward your hiding place, squinting. But then, without a word, the older one turns, her basket heavier now, and leads the others deeper into the woods. Within moments, they vanish into a gap in the undergrowth, as if the forest opened just for them. And maybe it did. Because the forest wasn't only a place of punishment. It was a place of persistence, of quiet rebellion, of everyday lives lived just outside the edges of officialdom. It sheltered women whose names never made it into songs, whose stories were never scrawled in ballads, but whose footprints are still here, beneath the bracken, in the soft moss, along the streams where mushrooms grow best. You rise, brushing leaves from your cloak, and keep walking. You're more careful now, not because of the law, but out of respect. Because long before anyone worried about royal venison or forest airs, someone's grandmother taught her daughter where the stinging nettles grew, and how not to get stung. The path becomes less certain the farther you go, more suggestion than trail, the kind you follow not because you can see it, but because something in the lay of the land feels right. Maybe it's instinct. Maybe it's the memory of countless feet before yours. Maybe it's just luck. You pass beneath an ancient oak, one so wide you'd need 4 arms to embrace it. Its bark is split with age, and its roots curl over the earth like the knuckles of an old man gripping the world. This tree has seen everything. Kings, poachers, storms, the slow crawl of laws, and it is unimpressed by all of them. And it reminds you, trees had their own roles in forest law. Because not all trees were created equal. Some were sacred. Some were property. Some were legal headaches that stood still while generations fought over them. And some, believe it or not, had names. Welcome to the strange, leafy world of Trielaw.in the Royal Forests. Vegetation wasn't just scenery. It was inventory. The forest law protected vert as fiercely as it did venison. Vert, in legal terms, meant all green growing things useful to the deer, primarily underwood, shrubs, saplings, and certain trees. The idea was simple. No vert, no deer. No deer, no royal hunting grounds. No royal hunting grounds, well, let's not speak such blasphemy, so cutting, damaging, or even leaning on the wrong tree could be a crime. Mainstream court rolls list fines for everything from bark stripping to unauthorized pollarding. Pruning the tops of trees to encourage new growth. If you pruned without permission, that was damage to the king's property. And good luck proving it was accidental. But there's a quirky side to this too. Some trees, particularly the old ones, became landmarks, legal reference points. They were used to define forest boundaries, property lines, and even spiritual or communal gathering spots. These trees often had names: Hangman's Beech, the Judging Oak, Three Sisters. You can still find them on some old maps, marked not as part of the scenery, but as witnesses. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some trees were believed to carry spirits. Folklore warned against cutting down certain oaks or ash trees, lest you wake something ancient and wrathful. There were even superstitions that bleeding a tree, cutting it in a way that caused sap to leak, could bring misfortune. Not from the forest law, from the forest itself. Historians still argue whether these beliefs influenced actual forest policy. Some say they softened enforcement in areas where people revered trees too deeply. Others say the crown happily ignored folklore, chopping down sacred groves when it suited a noble's fencing project. But one thing is certain: trees were watched. You run your fingers along the rough bark of the oak beside you. It's been struck by lightning once, maybe twice. A long vertical scar splits its trunk, healed but still raw-looking in places. You wonder if this was one of the named trees. If it once stood at the corner of three manors. If its branches shaded a deal, a duel, or a dozen hidden fires. You imagine a man once standing here, hand on this very trunk, swearing he'd never cut another stick if the verdure let him go. You imagine the tree listening, and not believing a word. Trees were often used to settle disputes. If two men argued about a boundary, they might bring witnesses to the tree in question. They'd point to knots, scars, carvings, even odd growths that were known markers. The line starts at the thorn, runs past the stone, then curves round the witch's oak, that sort of thing. And if the tree died, so did the proof. Suddenly, your eye catches something unusual. A small ring of stones. Not a hearth, not a marker, but a planting circle. You step closer and see a young sapling growing at its center. Its bark is pale, its limbs thin and awkward. Someone planted this recently. Perhaps a replacement for something old. Perhaps a quiet promise. You crouch beside it and brush away leaves from the base. Someone has carved a small symbol into one of the stones. A looping figure 8. Could be a family mark. Could be something older. You don't touch it, because you're starting to feel what the forest has always known. That trees keep things. Stories. Secrets. Scars. And they never forget. You stand again, walking on through a grove of hawthorn and birch. These are younger trees, but they rustle with just as much weight. And as you move, you realize how little space is left untouched by judgment. Even the plants have paperwork that in the royal forest. Everything that grew had a label, either legal or suspicious. Mushrooms could be claimed. Bracken could be restricted. Saplings could be illegal if they stood in the wrong clump. The forest was alive but also administrated, as if someone were trying to count every leaf. And maybe they were. But the trees, they didn't care. They grew anyway, sideways, crooked, through walls and over fences. They swallowed signs, outlived boundaries, and when the foresters died, the verdures retired, and the kings turned to dust. The trees were still here, waiting. The sun climbs higher now, brushing the tops of the trees with a pale gold that turns everything below it dim and green by contrast. You trudge along a ridge trail, dry leaves crunching faintly beneath your boots, and realize that hunger has started tapping you on the shoulder again. There's nothing in your pouch but crumbs and stubborn hope, and you know better than to gather anything without consequence. Because in the royal forest, even eating was regulated. You step into a clearing where the grass grows in flattened clumps, the way it does after livestock have spent time there. And you realize, this used to be a forest pasture. And just like that, you're in the center of one of the most overlooked and most important chapters of forest law, the economy of the greenwood. Forget kings and deer and noble hunts for a moment. Let's talk about moss and sticks and fungus. Let's talk about how the forest was not only a stage for punishment, but a marketplace, a medieval strip mall made of bark and bramble. Because long before we started thinking of nature as something to be protected from people, people lived off nature. And forests, especially royal ones, weren't just full of laws. They were full of stuff, useful stuff, valuable stuff, and people found ways to survive and even profit from what grew underfoot and overhead. This is what the forest called the rights of common. And they were everything. You could have the right to gather firewood, estover, or graze livestock, agistment, or cut turf for fuel, turbary, or fish in forest streams, piscary, or gather fallen branches, houseboat, or bracken for bedding, or even, yes, harvest honey from wild bees, a rare right known as beehote. If it grew, grazed, or buzzed, someone had a claim to it. The trick? You needed legal permission, and that permission was often tangled in heritage, custom, and politics. If your grandfather had the right to collect deadwood on St. Giles' Day from the east bank of the Glen, maybe you still could. But if the Verdeer forgot or decided not to recognize it this year, well, good luck. Mainstream historians agree that for many villagers, forest resources made up a major portion of their survival, especially in lean years. Timber for tools, herbs for healing, nuts for food, bramble shoots for weaving, even moss for insulation, and yes, wound dressing. And here's your quirky fact for the hour. In some areas, villagers would gather lichen from trees to dye wool. A rich purple hue from something most people ignored or scraped off. One man's mold was another's wardrobe upgrade. Of course. This entire economy existed under a cloud of suspicion. You might have the right to cut bracken, but not too much. You could collect berries, but not damage the bushes. You could graze your cows, but only on the western slope during approved months, and don't let them drink from the deer stream. And yes, that was a real law. Historians still argue whether these rights were genuinely honored or used as tools of control. Some suggest local officials enforced them fairly, recognizing the ancient customs. Others say the forest court was just another way to extract fines when money ran low and lords needed wine. You step into the remains of what was once a charcoal burning pit. Blackened earth still visible, now overgrown with weeds. A ring of stones marks the edge. Charcoal burning was one of the oldest forest trades, and one of the riskiest. Because while it was legal, if licensed, it required cutting and smoldering wood in a very specific way. And if you did it too close to royal deer trails, or used protected wood, or made too much smoke, you'd be fined. Or worse. Charcoal burners often lived in the forest for months at a time, watching their smoldering piles like parents with colicky babies. They slept under canvas, cooked over embers, told stories in the dark. Some became semi-permanent residents of the greenwood. Ghosts with soot-stained fingers. There's something sacred about the way people tried to balance survival with legality. They didn't want to break the law. They just wanted to eat, to keep warm, to dye their cloaks, to raise their pigs. And the forest, rich as it was, always came with a price tag. And still, some bartered. Some negotiated. Some found cracks in the system. You walk past a patch of mushrooms, chanterelles, you think, and resist the urge to pick one. You remember a tale about a monk who lost his hand for gathering truffles with intention to sell. His garden grew quieter after that. But you do pause by a patch of soft moss. Smells sweet, earthy. You think about what it meant for people who couldn't afford cloth, who stuffed moss into boots, who dried it, pressed it, used it to clean pots, or soothe fevers, or line the gaps in cottage walls to keep out the cold. The forest wasn't a wilderness, it was a storehouse, a medicine cabinet, pantry, a workshop. But only if you played by the rules, or at least looked like you were. You walk on now, empty-handed. though the forest offers plenty. Because you know that, in this place, even gratitude might need a license. You walk for some time in quiet thought, weaving between trees as the light dapples and dances across the forest floor. By now, you've learned the rhythm of this place. You step where the leaves are dry, avoid where moss hides slick roots, and keep your eyes open not just for deer or foresters, but for the smallest signs of life. Because in a forest this watched, even fun is suspicious. You start to smell something odd, a sharp, yeasty scent tangled with something slightly burnt. And then you hear it. Laughter. Not the kind of laugh you'd expect from nobles chasing a hart or children playing in a field. No, this is the kind of laugh that comes from someone who knows they're doing something mildly illegal and doesn't care. A tipsy, late morning, don't tell the verdere kind of laugh. You follow the sound and come to a clearing, just behind a low ridge. Peeking over, you spot a group of men, 4, maybe 5, seated around a makeshift camp. One is holding a jug. Another is trying to balance a tin mug on a walking stick. A loaf of something misshapen and half-burnt rests on a stone. Someone's singing a little off-key that they're drunk that in the king's forest. Bold. And it reminds you of one of the more overlooked risks of life under forest law. Even merriment could be a misdemeanor. Let's talk about foraging meets foolishness. The forest was filled with all sorts of useful and delicious things. Berries, hazelnuts, wild garlic, mushrooms, apples from forgotten orchards, honey from feral hives. But once alcohol entered the picture, things got complicated. Because brewing, even on a small scale, was tightly watched. Ale required barley, water, sometimes herbs, and, of course, firewood, all of which were, in some way or another, entangled in forest law. Brewing without a license wasn't just a municipal issue. It could be a forest offense if the resources were gathered within its bounds. That mug balancing on a stick? It might hold the taste of stolen ingredients. That jug? Conceivably contraband. That laughter? Suspiciously uninhibited. Mainstream sources reveal that many communities near royal forests had unofficial gatherings. Ale feasts, foraging walks, accidental festivals that were tolerated as long as no one complained. But when someone did complain, well, then the charges piled up: illegal gathering, misuse of wood, unauthorized fire pits, even public disorder. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some areas, the selling of mushrooms was explicitly forbidden without the local lord's approval. Why? Because certain rare fungi were considered delicacies, valuable enough to be taxed, protected, or claimed outright by manorial rights. Get caught hawking chanterelles at the wrong stall and you could be fined, or worse, banned from collecting altogether. You crouch lower, watching the men pass around the jug. One of them trips while dancing, his leg tangling in a root, and the others erupt into laughter so loud it startles a rook from the treetops. They're harmless, probably. Maybe charcoal burners on break. Maybe tanners. Maybe just men who decided today was worth remembering for the wrong reasons. Historians still debate how common these informal forest parties were. Some claim they were rare, hidden affairs. Others argue they were seasonal rituals, passed down like recipes, an open secret no one wrote down but everyone knew. A way to reclaim joy in a place so often built on fear. And then, of course, there's the matter of mushrooms. You've seen your fair share of them today. Some poisonous, some nourishing, some very much not legal to pick if the wrong eyes are watching. Because the forest wasn't just a garden, it was a ledger, and everything in it had a theoretical value. Take honey, for example. Wild hives in the forest belonged to the king, unless you had explicit permission to harvest them. The wax could be used in candles, the honey traded or preserved. But do it without a permit? Theft. Do it twice? Mutilation. Same with nuts. Same with wild leeks. Same with herbs that could ease childbirth or slow a fever. The forest was full of medicine. But you'd better not try to heal anyone without a note from the bureaucracy. You retreat from the ridge slowly, unwilling to interrupt the drunken revelry. They're probably not dangerous, just reckless, or maybe defiant. Either way, they're part of the living memory of this place. Those who found ways to enjoy the forest, despite the rules. You walk on, and after a time the scent of yeast fades, replaced by the sharp tang of crushed fern and something sweeter, maybe early berries. You stop near a low bush, where blackberries droop like ornaments on thorny limbs. They glisten with dew, temptingly ripe. You hesitate. Point one berry. Point one moment of sweetness. You pluck it and eat it before your conscience can finish writing the fine. It tastes like summer and defiance. Because out here, even a snack can be an act of rebellion. You keep walking, wiping the berry juice from your thumb like you've just committed a minor, fruit-stained sin, which, under forest law, you probably have. The path narrows again, twisting through a grove of hazel and elder, the kind of place where every twig seems to snap louder than it should. Your stomach still rumbles. That one blackberry didn't stand a chance. Then, you see it. A low, mossy structure tucked into the side of a hill, barely more than a lean-to, its roof sagging beneath the weight of damp leaves. You approach cautiously. There's no smoke, no sounds of life, just the smell of earth and old wood. Abandoned, you think, or perhaps simply left untouched for a time. Inside, a stack of dry grass, a few bones in a corner, and scrawled on the inside of a timber beam in charcoal, "I was hungry, so I lived." And just like that, your thoughts turn to starvation, and what it meant to survive within a system that told you the king's deer were more valuable than your life. Because forest law wasn't just inconvenient or annoying. In the cruel months of winter, it was deadly. You see, the deer weren't just symbols of royal authority. They were walking meals, and the one thing that could save you if everything else failed. They moved through the snow when the fields were frozen. They left tracks when the rivers stopped flowing. Their meat could last through a bitter February. And yet, if you killed one, you could lose your hand, or your family, or your home. Mainstream historical accounts detail countless cases where villagers stood before forest courts, pleading that they had no choice. No bread, no grain, no coin, just a bow and a hunger too deep to argue with. Some were spared, fined, and warned. Others weren't, and some simply disappeared into the woods, choosing outlawry over obedience. There's a case from the 13th century of a man caught skinning a deer beneath a hawthorn tree. He had 3 children. One of them had died the week before. He admitted the act but said nothing more. The court record notes simply, "Branded and released." A mercy, perhaps, or just efficiency. And here's your quirky fact. In some villages near royal forests, it was common practice for widows to feed their families with venison, secretly and often with help. A sympathetic forester might look the other way. A neighbor might claim the deer had died of illness. In one recorded case, a priest declared a poached deer to be fallen by God's will, and distributed it to the poor as alms. Historians still argue whether this quiet resistance was widespread or exceptional. But it's clear that many communities treated the forest not as forbidden, but as owed. A birthright denied by royal whim. A larder locked by someone who didn't live there. You sit in the lean-to for a while, resting your back against the cold wall. You imagine being here in midwinter, fireless, foodless, listening to the distant baying of hounds and knowing they weren't coming for help. You wonder how many people the forest took, not with wolves or wild boars, but with rules, and yet, somehow people survived. They learned the safe paths, the useful herbs, the seasons of quiet abundance when mushrooms and nettles and berries could fill a pot, even if only for a few weeks. They built these lean-tos, these memories. Some even fought back. There were stories, some real, some less so, of organized poaching rings. Men and women who didn't just snare rabbits but coordinated deer hunts, moved meat across counties, bribed wardens, and set up trading networks that quietly mocked the king's claim. One legend tells of a butcher who built a false wall in his cellar to hide a venison smokehouse. Took them 6 years to find it. By then, he'd fed half the village. You stand again, letting the lean-to fade into the trees behind you. You don't look back. Places like that shouldn't be disturbed too long. They carry grief in the soil. Further on, you pass a patch of overturned earth. Boar marks, you think. But maybe not wild ones. It was common in some areas to let pigs roam even when it wasn't pannage season. So long as you called them strays and crossed your fingers, no one checked. They'd root through anything. Even graves, according to a rather grim local tale about a pig and a poorly chosen woodland burial. Survival was messy. And so was morality. You cross a shallow brook, more stones than water this time of year, and as you do, a soft wind carries the scent of wood smoke. Far off, faint, not close enough to worry. just close enough to feel comforting. Someone else is surviving too. And that's the strange, aching truth of this place. The king said the forest was his. The laws said so too. But the people who lived in its shadows? They knew better. They knew that when your belly was empty and your fields were bare, a deer wasn't royal. It was dinner. And some nights, dinner is worth the risk. The smell of smoke follows you for a while, teasing your senses with the ghost of warmth, the memory of stews never tasted. You don't turn toward it. Whoever's tending that fire deserves their privacy, and you've learned by now that in the royal forest, discretion is survival. The trees shift again, less tangled, more orderly. A row of elms curves in an almost suspiciously straight line. The ground underfoot is smoother, too, littered with fewer branches, as though someone's been sweeping. And just ahead, a low stone wall, half collapsed, covered in ivy but unmistakably intentional. You've wandered into managed woodland. But not by the king this time. Why monks? Yes, believe it or not, some of the cleverest and most calculated players in the forest law game wore robes, rang bells, and said prayers before breakfast. The monasteries, the abbeys, the quiet, chanting communities that knew how to say amen and advantage in the same breath. Because here's the twist. While many peasants were crushed by forest law, the church had a knack for negotiating with it. Mainstream records show that monasteries near royal forests often petitioned for special rights and got them. Grazing rights for sheep, access to timber for chapel repairs, pannage privileges for pigs, even licenses to trap rabbits and fish local streams, under the argument that fasting days required specific dietary loopholes. The crown usually allowed it. Why? Because monks were useful. They prayed for the king. They recorded his deeds. They could bless his horses and his heirs. Denying them fuel or food wasn't just unpopular. It was risky. But let's not pretend they were innocent woodland wanderers. Some monasteries grew rich, very rich, from their forest holdings. They cleared trees for contemplation, which conveniently created more farmland. They built fish ponds that expanded mysteriously into poaching zones. They planted fast-growing willows and hazel to harvest for baskets and fencing. And they wrote all their requests in perfect Latin, which helped. There's even a quirky tale about a Cistercian abbey that trained its own group of foresters, lay brothers who patrolled the woods not for the king, but for the abbot. If you poached a deer on their land, they didn't send you to the royal court. They sent Brother Wilfrid, who carried both a cross and a cudgel, and was known to recite psalms while doling out bruises. And here's your fringe fact. In some abbeys, especially those near borders between royal forest and free land, monks would quietly move boundary markers at night. Not far, just enough to shift a grove of valuable trees into their favor. For the glory of God, of course. Historians still argue whether monastic involvement in forest management helped soften the impact of forest law or simply redirected its benefits. Some say monasteries offered sanctuary to the hungry, the cold, the deerless. Others say they acted like landlords in robes, collecting rents, enforcing rules, and issuing fines with the same bureaucratic precision as the king's men. You approach the stone wall, running your hand along its mossy top. Just beyond it, you spot neat rows of hazel coppice, young trees cut low, already sprouting again. A classic monastic method. Controlled growth, rotational harvesting. The forest as renewable resource. There's peace here. But not the wild kind. This is structured peace. Measured, scheduled, authorized. And yet, you can't help but admire the subtle genius of it all. While nobles roared through the woods on horseback and peasants were dragged to court for picking up a stick, the monks quietly built timber barns and brewed alesh behind stone walls. They learned the rules of the forest, not to break them, but to bend them. You pass a wooden sign nailed to a tree, its script faded but still legible. Latin, likely some psalm, maybe a warning, maybe a blessing, maybe both. Either way, it marks this place as theirs. And you, while not exactly trespassing, are definitely not expected. So you keep walking, not because you're afraid, but because you respect the silence here. The air feels different, drier, like the forest is being watched from above, not by wardens this time, but by saints. Still, it's important to remember, the church wasn't above politics, or economics, or venison. In fact, some of the grandest medieval feasts, complete with deer roasts and pottage, were held in abbeys. And while fasting was required on holy days, exceptions were often made. Illness being a common excuse. And wouldn't you know? Roast boar was excellent for the nerves. You reach a small stream running beside the trail, dammed slightly with stone. A fish trap, no doubt. Cleverly disguised, but still there. Monks needed protein, too. You pause, kneeling to wash your hands. The water is cool and clear, with the faintest hint of mint from somewhere upstream. You drink. Tastes clean. It tastes permitted. You rise and move on, leaving the managed woods behind, their order and discipline already fading beneath the older, wilder parts of the forest. But as you walk, you can't help thinking. The monks had it figured out. They didn't fight the forest law. They understood it. Then they edited it just enough to build their lives around it. And maybe that's the real secret. You don't need to break the rules to survive the royal forest. You just need to learn where they bend. The monastic groves behind you now. The forest grows denser again, as if shaking off the scent of incense and discipline. The neat coppices give way to tangled undergrowth and crooked trees, their limbs reaching out like elbows jostling for space. Here, paths meander, boundaries blur, and the forest feels feral again. You pause at a clearing where 3 old boundary stones stand in a crooked line. You walk to one and brush away the moss. There's a marking, faint, worn, but definitely deliberate. You turn to the second stone. A different mark. And the third? No mark at all. You've stumbled into the murky world of forest borders, and the long, petty, sometimes hilarious history of land that moved when no one was looking. Because in the royal forests, borders weren't always fixed. And when something's not fixed, it can be moved. And when something can be moved, people will move it. Welcome to the long tradition of boundary disputes and creative cartography. When William the Conqueror and his successors declared vast swaths of England royal forest, they weren't too bothered with precision. Forests were marked out broadly, often with vague descriptions like from the great oak to the stream by Dunmere, thence to the hillock near the chapel. Charming, but open to interpretation. Mainstream records from the 12th and 13th centuries are filled with disputes about where exactly the forest ended. And if you were a local landowner or even a particularly brave peasant, you wanted your land to be just outside the royal bounds. Because inside the forest meant restrictions. Outside meant freedom. And so, the dance began. People moved boundary markers. They bribed surveyors. They cut down key trees, claiming they'd never seen them before. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some villagers would actually hold night ceremonies to walk the bounds of their parish, a tradition called beating the bounds. They'd walk the edges of their land, sometimes whipping children with birch branches to ensure they'd remember the landmarks for future disputes. That's right, generational trauma in the name of property law. You look again at the 3 stones in front of you. Imagine them being shifted under cover of darkness, just a few feet, just enough to pull that productive apple grove out of royal oversight. It wouldn't be noticed until the next perambulation, the official walkabout by crown representatives to check the forest's extent. But by then, the trees would be a little older, the fruit a little sweeter, and the excuse a little more plausible. Must have always been this way. Someone would shrug. Historians still argue whether these boundary shifts were localized incidents or part of a wider, semi-organized effort by rural communities to reclaim land. The answer is likely both. Some villages worked together to protect their resources. Others simply looked out for their own hedgerows and hoped no one asked too many questions. Even noble families got involved. There are records of barons building manor houses right on the edge of forests to strategically skirt certain laws. One family even built a deer park adjacent to a royal forest, stocked it with wild deer, and claimed that any similarities in appearance were coincidental. Bold move. You pass a fallen tree with an iron ring embedded in its base. A leftover from some long-forgotten surveyor's equipment. Maybe. Or maybe a marker. Or maybe just another mystery the forest never saw fit to explain. The truth is, in the medieval mind, maps weren't sacred. They were suggestions, guidelines, expressions of power more than geography. A border drawn by the king could be redrawn by a storm. A creek could flood and change its course. A tree could fall and erase the only known reference point for an entire legal claim. And the locals? They learned to adapt. They walked by night. They whispered instructions. They passed down stories of where the oak used to be and where the line really runs if you know the old way. You stop at a fork in the trail, uncertain. One path curves gently down toward a stream. The other climbs into thicker trees. There's no sign, no marker. And suddenly, the ambiguity isn't charming, it's nerve-wracking because depending on where you are right now, you might be a free traveler or a trespasser. It all depends on where someone thinks the line is. And that's the game, isn't it? Forest law wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about defining space, drawing imaginary lines and daring people to cross them. Lines that could move, vanish, or reappear depending on who was looking and why. But the forest itself, it never moved. It just watched. You take the left path, trusting your instincts, or perhaps just flipping a mental coin. The trail narrows but grows lighter as the canopy thins. And as you walk, you think about all the people who once stood where you are, wondering if they were inside the law or just outside enough to breathe. And you realize something comforting in all of it. No matter how many maps were drawn, no matter how many stones were placed, the forest always knew where it ended, even when no one else did. The path winds slowly downward now, curling around a ridge where the trees part just enough to let the sunlight warm your shoulders. You walk a little taller, a little less wary. But it's a fragile confidence, because out here, every step could still be a crime. And as you pass beneath a twisted ash, you're reminded, what happened after you were caught could be just as bewildering as the law itself. Let's talk about the punishments. You might imagine that forest law handed out gentle slaps on the wrist. A coin here, a scolding there, maybe a slap with a birch twig if you were particularly cheeky. But the truth, it got grim, fast. Because in the eyes of the crown, forest offenses weren't petty. They were personal. You weren't just gathering sticks, you were tampering with royal privilege. You weren't poaching deer, you were stealing from the king's own hand. And so the punishments weren't just deterrents. They were messages. Mainstream records are peppered with them. Fines, yes, but also imprisonment, branding, mutilation, exile, and, in the earliest days, even death. The standard punishment for killing one of the king's deer? In many cases, it was blinding or losing a hand. Later reforms softened that to fines or branding, but the message remained. This isn't yours. One of the more grotesque early penalties involved castration, usually reserved for repeat poachers or those who got a little too bold with their traps. It was rare, but not unheard of. Forest law didn't shy away from spectacle. A maimed man was a walking billboard. Don't do what I did. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some officials tried to get creative. One man in Wiltshire, caught stealing timber 3 times, was sentenced not to jail, but to walk the bounds of the forest barefoot, carrying a bundle of sticks he wasn't allowed to drop. If he faltered, he was flogged. If he finished, he was forgiven. The villagers called it the stick walk. It didn't catch on. You pass a mossy boulder with strange markings, a faded X, carved deep and old. Maybe a boundary, maybe a warning, maybe both. You can't help but imagine someone kneeling here once, caught with a snare in their hand and no good answer on their lips. And the fines. Oh, the fines. They weren't gentle. Forest courts could impose hefty fees for the most minor of infractions. Carrying a bough, walking off the path, collecting too much brushwood, letting your pigs graze too long. Some villagers lived their entire lives in quiet debt to the forest court. If you couldn't pay, you might lose your tools, your livestock, your land. And in some cruel twists of irony, your children might be indentured to a lord in exchange for clearing your name. Historians still argue whether these punishments were consistently enforced or largely symbolic, used more to scare than to act. The answer, of course, depends on the forest, and the mood of the court, and whether or not the local verderer liked the way you looked that day. You walk on and think of the many who endured these punishments, not because they were greedy or rebellious, but because they were hungry, cold, desperate, or just unlucky. You think of the man who lost 2 fingers for gathering firewood during a hard frost, of the woman fined for letting her cow drink from a stream reserved for royal deer, of the teenage boy caught carrying a rabbit and sentenced to wear a wooden yoke in the village square for 3 days. So others may see and understand. Forest justice was as much performance as it was punishment. And sometimes, the spectacle wasn't about making an example, but about making peace. You round a bend and spot a small stone platform, now mostly covered in vines. It was likely once a place for public declarations, or sentences, or possibly pardons. Because even in this tangle of harsh rules, there were moments of grace. A king might issue a blanket pardon for forest offenses in celebration of a wedding or a coronation. A lord might forgive fines in exchange for loyalty or military service. A local priest might intervene, claiming penance and confession more appropriate than a branding iron, and occasionally, the forest court itself showed mercy that if a man could prove he acted out of necessity, if his village stood behind him or if his child had died that winter, he might walk free. Scarred, perhaps, but free. The forest was cruel, but it wasn't always heartless. You sit for a moment on the stone, brushing aside leaves, and let your mind wander through the forest's long ledger of punishment and pardon. You think of all the names carved into forgotten court rolls, of the hands that signed the orders, of the voices that trembled under oaths, and of the trees that watched it all in silence. Out here, justice didn't wear a blindfold. It wore bark and bramble. It watched you with deer eyes. It whispered through the underbrush and judged you not only by your actions, but by your timing, your luck, and the mood of the man with the seal. You stand again and move on, your shoulders a little heavier. Because now you understand something vital. In the royal forest, the worst crime wasn't poaching or foraging. It was being caught. You move on, stepping through a narrow corridor of trees that crowd the path like suspicious onlookers. Their branches hang low, and you duck instinctively, brushing past damp leaves still dripping with last night's dew. The silence has weight again, and it makes you uneasy. Not fearful, just alert. And then, faint at first, but growing as you crest a gentle slope, you hear it. A voice, low, gravelly, and angry. Not the call of a bird or the howl of a fox. A human voice, raised in protest. Then another joins in, sharp, indignant. And then another. The words are distant, muddled by trees, but you recognize the rhythm. They're arguing. You inch forward, staying off the main track, keeping low. Through a break in the brush, you spot them. A group of villagers, 6 or 7 strong, gathered in a small clearing around a cart. One man stands gesturing furiously toward a uniformed figure, a forester, judging by the color of his cloak and the rod in his hand. The villagers shout. The forester stays stone-faced, gripping a scroll in one hand and a wax tablet in the other. You've stumbled into a rebellion. Not the fiery kind with torches and battle cries. No, this is the quiet, constant kind, rural defiance. The kind that grows slowly, like roots cracking through stone. Because when forest law went too far, people didn't always go silently, they fought back. Sometimes with arrows, yes, but more often with petitions. With threats. With pickaxes hidden beneath baskets of firewood. With pigs released into forbidden glades in the middle of the night. With rage. Mainstream historical accounts record dozens of forest uprisings. Not grand wars. Not mass revolts. Just local people pushed too far. One such episode occurred in the 1290s, in a hamlet bordering the New Forest. A verdeer ordered the seizure of 2 pigs found grazing out of season. The villagers responded by storming the forest court, breaking into the holding pen, and releasing every animal inside, including the bailiff's horse. They were fined, of course. But the message stuck. In another case, a group of women in Lincolnshire were recorded pelting a forester with berries and clods of turf after he tried to fine them for picking medicinal herbs. The record notes that he left the glade hastily and did not return for 3 days. And here's your quirky tidbit. In at least one documented incident, an entire village turned its back on a visiting forest warden during a public reading of the law, literally turned around. The record reads, "None would face him, even the dogs slept. Passive resistance, medieval style. You duck behind a tree, listening as the argument in the clearing intensifies. You cannot take the cart, it is ours," one man cries. "You broke the bounds," the forester replies, almost bored. "The timber was felled without license. 3 trees deadfall," someone yells. "We do not cut green. It is not yours to cut," the forester says. "Even dead, it belongs to the crown." The word crown hangs in the air like a bitter taste. This isn't just about wood. It never is. This is about survival. about heat in the cold months, about roofs that don't leak, about tools that don't splinter and fences that don't fall. And the forest law, the same law that protects the king's deer and his precious undergrowth, has drawn the line, once again, between need and permission. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these local rebellions. Some say they sparked reform. Others claim they were like rain on stone, loud for a moment, but leaving no mark. But ask the villagers? For them, it wasn't about change. It was about dignity. You crouch lower as the forester finishes speaking, rolls up his scroll, and gestures toward the cart. Two young men step forward, reluctantly, and begin dragging it away. The villagers don't stop them. Not because they agree, but because they know they'll see that cart again. Maybe not that one, but one like it. And next time, it might come back full of their firewood. Rebellion, in the royal forest, wasn't an event. It was a habit. A way of life, lived with one eye on the treetops and one hand always ready to pull back what had been taken. You slip away unnoticed, your footsteps soft in the mulch, heart beating a little faster. Not from fear, but from something like kinship. You understand them, because in the end, the royal forest was more than trees and deer and scrolls. It was a pressure, one that pressed down on everyone. And sometimes, people pushed back. With fists, with words, with silence so heavy, it made the law feel like paper in a storm. You walk for a while in silence, the villagers' voices still echoing faintly in your ears. Their defiance lingers in the air, heavy as mist. It's strange how something so quiet, an argument, a protest, a refusal, can leave a louder impression than hoofbeats or horns. The path forks again, and this time, you choose the hill. Your calves burn as you climb, weaving between thickets and stone outcrops until the trees begin to thin. At the crest, you find what must have once been a lookout point. Flat rock, waist-high, just enough of a clearing to see the land roll out before you. And its beautiful forests stretch out in every direction. Their canopies ripple like green oceans, dotted with darker pools of yew and lighter sprays of birch. Far off, you see the hint of smoke, likely a village chimney. To the south, the faint line of a road. And between all of it, forest. So much forest. And then you realize, what you're looking at isn't just land. It's legacy. Because this view, this vast, tangled sea of trees, has been shaped by centuries of law. And the law, in turn, was shaped by power. And now that power lies carved into stones, buried in court rolls, and whispered through the bracken, you're standing in a system that has outlived kings. A forest with paperwork. Let's talk about how it ended. Well, not ended exactly, just changed. Because forest law, for all its absurdities, didn't disappear in a single moment. Faded, slowly, unevenly, like fog lifting in patches. Mainstream history points to several key turning points. The Charter of the Forest, of course, reigned in the worst of the abuses in 1217. But the forest courts still lingered. So did the punishments. So did the absurd complexity. In many places, forest law continued deep into the 14th century and beyond. But the world was changing. The Black Death, political unrest, the rise of towns and trade. The crown needed revenue in new ways. Selling off forest rights became profitable. And suddenly, what had once been sacrosanct was now negotiable. By the 16th century, under Henry VIII, vast swaths of royal forest were being disafforested, formally removed from forest law, sometimes parceled out to nobles, sometimes sold to landowners, sometimes simply abandoned to time. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some cases, the locals celebrated by immediately cutting down trees, not for wood, but for symbolism. One chronicler wrote that within hours of a forest's dissolution, there was not a sapling left unclaimed, nor a deer seen for miles. It was like shaking off a long-held breath. Historians still argue whether this disafforestation was progress or tragedy. On one hand, it meant freedom. People could finally use the land as they needed. On the other hand, it led to enclosure, private estates, and eventually the fencing off of lands once shared. The forest wasn't just lost to law. It was lost to ownership. And yet, some forests survived. Not just as places, but as ideas. You sit on the rock and think about that. About how forest law began as royal privilege and transformed into a system of control. about how it was resisted by pig herders and poachers, monks and mothers, about how every stick, every mushroom, every footstep had a price and how people paid it, or didn't. You think about the Verdeers and their scrolls, about the cart being dragged away this morning, about the poachers and the priests, about the trees that were counted, named, and sometimes worshipped. You think about all of it, and you realize the forest was never just about the trees. It was about power, and the people who dared to challenge it. You rise and dust off your hands, the wind tugging at your cloak. Below you, the forest hums, timeless, watchful, alive in ways the law never could be. You descend the hill slowly, the sun warm at your back, the forest swallowing your path once more. You've seen the bones beneath the bark, the scrolls buried in the roots. You've walked through law and legend alike. And you know now, the forest doesn't forget. But sometimes, it forgives. The descent from the hill is gentler than you expected, soft soil underfoot, birdsong picking up as if the trees themselves are sighing in relief after your reflection above. The canopy here is thick, but in that calm, sheltering way. Not oppressive, the kind of shade that feels earned. You pass a crumbling stone wall, lichen-covered, too low to keep anything in or out. It's not a fence anymore, it's a memory. And just beyond it, you come across something strange. A circle of stumps. Not cut recently, no raw edges. Just the ghostly seats of trees long gone. You pause in the middle and feel something shift beneath your boots. Not in the earth, in the air. This was a gathering place. And that brings us to the final and perhaps strangest ritual of the royal forest. The courts themselves. We've talked about the forest law, about the foresters, the fines, the felonies. But now, let's sit with how justice was actually delivered. The settings, the sounds, the performance. Because forest courts were often public theater. You might imagine grand halls or heavy stone benches. But in many cases, courts were held outdoors. Right in the forest. Beneath trees, on raised mounds, beside ancient oaks with names older than the clerks themselves. Mainstream records describe these sessions in vivid, dusty detail. A Verdeer stands. A clerk unrolls the parchment. Accused villagers shuffle forward. Witnesses mumble. Someone sneezes and is glared at. Chickens wander into the proceedings. Dogs snore under the benches. A pot of ale is passed around at the edge, just out of view. And justice is dispensed. It wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was deathly dull. A list of names, a roll of fines, a few warnings, but the spectacle mattered. The formality, the performance. Because forest law was never just about punishing. It was about reminding. Reminding you where you stood. Reminding you who the trees belonged to. And reminding everyone else what happened when someone forgot. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, the forest court met beneath a tree called the justice oak. A real tree chosen for its visibility and roots. In a few places, the same tree was used for over 2 centuries. It was said to be bad luck to cut it down. One legend even claims a man who tried to do so was later gored by a stag, sent by the forest itself. Historians still debate the extent of these open-air courts. Some say they were symbolic, only used for minor matters. Others point to serious sentences passed beneath canopies and crows. But everyone agrees they happened. And they meant something. You pace the circle of stumps slowly. 1, 2, 3, 7 in total. Not enough for a jury, but enough for a council. Maybe this wasn't an official court. Maybe it was local, informal, a gathering of elders, or poachers, or just neighbors deciding whether that firewood fine should really stick. Justice in the forest wasn't always royal. Sometimes it was relational. A matter of knowing who needed what, of knowing when to look away, when to speak up, when to carry word to the Verdeer, and when to lose the parchment on the way. You stop at the largest stump. Its surface is split with age and weather. You picture a man standing here once, clearing his throat, announcing the sentence of a boy who'd snared a rabbit too close to the king's fence. His voice would have been firm, his hands probably shaking. And the forest, it would have listened. Because that's the thing about the greenwood, it heard everything. The laughter, the guilt, the arguments, the quiet defiance. It still hears. You sit on the stump, just for a moment. Smoother than it looks. You imagine someone carved it that way long ago during a particularly tedious court session. You wonder how many feet stood where yours are now. How many decisions were made in this ring of trees. How many regrets were carried home afterward. Then, gently, you rise. You brush bark from your hands. You leave the circle without a word. Because you've learned something out here. The forest never needed gibbets or guards to keep you in line. It had rituals. And rituals last. The trail pulls you eastward now, curving between elder trees heavy with age, their branches drooping like tired arms. The air grows still again, quieter than before. You notice it not in the absence of birdsong, but in the stillness of your own thoughts. You've been walking a long time. You've passed courts, camps, charcoal fires, and poachers' trails. You've walked through pages of unwritten law, stumbled over roots of rebellion, and brushed your hands against bark that remembers more than any ledger. Now, at last, you begin to feel the weight of the forest lifting. Not because it's any less vast, but because you've learned its language. And here, in this quieter grove, it's time to talk about what happened when the law stopped watching, because eventually even the mightiest rules grow old. Let's talk about the forgetting. When royal forest law began to fade, it didn't vanish with drama or ceremony. There was no great pronouncement, no trumpet fanfare, no forest-wide decree that said, "You may now gather your sticks in peace." Instead, people simply stopped obeying. It began slowly. A branch here, a deer trap left overnight, a cartload of turf that nobody bothered to measure. The verdure didn't show up one season. The forest court met once every few years instead of quarterly. The scrolls were shorter. The fines were smaller. The ink dried. The law didn't collapse. It was outgrown. Mainstream historians refer to this as the quiet decline of forest law, a slow erosion of enforcement brought about by political shifts, changing monarchs, and the rise of private land ownership. Once nobles began purchasing large sections of disafforested land, the crown's grip loosened. Land that had been for the deer was now for the estate. Same restrictions, perhaps, but different masters, and here's your quirky tidbit. In one 17th century village, a local lord inherited a royal forest and immediately declared it no longer sacred, allowing villagers to collect wood freely. Festival broke out. Someone dressed up as a deer and paraded through town. They called him Lord Tyne, after a local term for antlers. He tripped on his own hooves and broke 2 fingers. History does not record whether this was part of the plan. What replaced forest law wasn't freedom, it was fencing. Enclosures swept through England in waves, transforming once communal spaces into private holdings. Villagers who had feared the king's deer now found themselves fearing the squire's shepherd. And the punishment for trespassing? Still severe, just less poetic. Historians still argue whether the loss of forest law was a liberation or another form of containment. On one hand, people could finally forage, hunt, and gather without fear of royal punishment. On the other, they now needed permission from new landlords. The velvet robes were gone, but the locked gates remained. You step over a fallen log, its core hollow and sweet-smelling with rot. Inside, mushrooms bloom like white coins. You don't touch them. Some habits die hard. And yet, in certain corners of England, traces of forest law linger. Some commoners still hold ancient rights, passed down like heirlooms to graze livestock, gather fuel, or collect fallen timber in specified woods. These rights of common are protected, sometimes jealously. In places like the New Forest, Epping Forest, and parts of the Forest of Dean, ancient customs still thread through modern life. You think of the old woman gathering mushrooms, of the poacher roasting venison, of the forester glancing the other way, of the monk planting hazel, of the outlaw hiding in tree roots, of the boy fined for a rabbit, of the pig rooting beneath a yew. And you wonder, how much of the lore remains in the forest? Not in scrolls, but in stories. How many customs survive because someone told someone else, "We always do it this way," even when the clerk forgot to write it down? This, perhaps, is the final lesson of the Greenwood, that memory is stronger than law, and forgetting a rule is not the same as healing from it. You follow the path as it dips through a thicket and out again into a gentle clearing. Feels lighter here, as if the forest has loosened its grip, just slightly, as if it's telling you, you've earned this moment. You breathe deeply. The air tastes of bark, moss, and something else. Peace. A small fox darts across your path ahead, bushy tail flashing like a firebrand before vanishing into fern. It doesn't pause to judge you, doesn't ask if your firewood is licensed. It just runs. Free. You follow no trail now, just instinct. The forest has thinned, not in trees but in tension, and every step feels less observed. The silence is no longer suspicion, it's invitation. You pass beneath a line of hornbeams whose trunks twist like rope. Their roots cross over each other, forming strange, natural arches. You step through one, half expecting to feel different on the other side. You don't. But everything does seem clearer. The air, the path, the weight of the story. Because by now, you've learned what the royal forest truly was. Not just land. Not just law. But a mirror held up to power, to poverty, to persistence. And in this last stretch of green, the final question rises. What was the forest to the people who lived in it? Not just those who ruled or rebelled, but the in-betweeners. The ordinary folk. The ones who learned to navigate between fear and necessity, guilt and gathering. You come upon a ring of stones, not a fire pit, not a court. Just stones. Each mossy, each roughly the same size, each worn as though sat upon often. And at the center, a tree stump carved flat, used more times than remembered. A family circle. Maybe a storyteller's spot at a school. Because the forest wasn't only hardship. It was home. For every poacher whipped, there was a child learning birdsong. For every woman fined for wood, there was a mother brewing nettle soup. For every outlaw branded, there was a young couple meeting at twilight under ash leaves too new to be noticed. Mainstream accounts rarely mention these lives. They prefer drama. Kings and courts, crimes and rebellions. But listen closely to local lore, village songs, family records, herbal journals, and the quiet forest life hums into focus. People lived here. Really lived. And not just in survival mode. They made traditions, raised children, buried loved ones beneath favorite trees. They used the land not just to endure, but to understand the world. Here's your quirky fact. Some villagers believed trees could carry memories. Not just spiritually, but literally. A certain knot in a certain oak might mean, my grandmother gathered herbs here. A notch in the bark meant, don't dig here. Bees once nested. These weren't laws. They were stories carved into wood, passed through touch and repetition. You walk slowly around the stone circle, imagining the generations who sat here. Someone likely carved a spoon right on this stump, told a tale about a silver stag who vanished into mist, sung a lullaby that ended with, and stay away from the king's glen. Historians still argue whether the forest fostered cultural richness or stifled it. But out here you begin to suspect, it did both. Punished, yes, but it also preserved, forced people to adapt, and in adapting to become more clever, more connected, more tuned. You sit on one of the stones. It's warm, just barely. The sun's been here longer than you have. And you realize this is what the forest gave, despite everything. Belonging, not granted by law but earned through endurance, through 1,000 tiny acts of defiance and devotion, through every berry picked in secret, every child hushed in a hollow, every footprint laid where they said you shouldn't walk. You breathe deep. The forest exhales with you. It's not forgiving, exactly, but it's no longer judging either. It's remembering. And so are you. You rise, slower now, and make your way onward. Not away from the forest, but into it. Not because you're fleeing, but because you're part of it now. You've listened, learned, left no scars, and that's all the forest ever wanted. Not obedience, not rebellion, but understanding. The trees shift again. Older now, thicker at the base. Their branches knotted with stories you can't quite hear but feel in your bones. You've walked long enough to know when a part of the forest is ancient, and this stretch hums with age. The light barely makes it to the forest floor here. It falls in shafts, like soft pillars in a cathedral built of leaves. And in this hushed green hush you realize, this is sacred ground. Not because of any altar or abbey, but because people said it was. And that makes it real. Because in the centuries of living beneath the canopy of royal law, people didn't just obey or resist. They ritualized. They made meaning in the margins. They filled the gaps between fines and edicts with ceremony. And so, we arrive at the folk customs of the forest. You sit beneath a yew, always a serious tree, never a casual one, and begin to remember the tales. Every community near the forest had its own traditions. Some were whispers, some were festivals, some were jokes told in the dark. But all of them were ways to make sense of a life lived under rules so strict, so strange, that laughter and lore became forms of survival. Mainstream records rarely mention these customs, but they show up between the lines, in the excuses people gave, the objects found in cottages, the songs transcribed by bored clerks who didn't understand the verses they were humming. Like the one about the deer that spoke Latin, or the widow's log, which could not be burned, only cradled, or the tradition of leaving bread at the foot of a certain tree, not for birds or beggars, but for the foresters of the past. A peace offering to ghosts in green, and here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, it was considered bad luck to carry a sprig of hawthorn through the forest in spring. It was said to draw the attention of royal eyes. Not deer, not spirits, officials. There was a belief that certain plants could summon surveillance. Imagine fearing that a flower might bring fines. Historians still debate whether these customs were superstition or satire. Likely both. But either way, they mattered. They gave people control, or at least the illusion of it. If the law said you couldn't hunt, maybe you could still sing to the stag and ask it to appear. If you couldn't gather herbs, maybe a charm carved in bark could make the illness pass anyway. If you couldn't protest the fines, you could at least mock the verdure in a mummer's play, performed under torchlight for the joy of laughter and the safety of masks. You reach into a patch of ferns and pull out a smooth stone, flat on one side. Someone has scratched something into it, just barely legible. A pair of antlers, and below them what might be a crown. Or a halo. You set it gently back where you found it. No one needs to know you touched it. Because even now, you feel the gravity of ritual. This forest held layers, rules written by kings and rules whispered by crones. Rules you could be fined for breaking. And rules you just didn't dare break. The first were printed. The second were felt. You pass beneath an arched bough and catch the scent of something sweet, clover, maybe, or the memory of a harvest festival held just beyond the trees, where villagers danced around a bonfire they weren't technically allowed to build. These customs didn't erase the forest law. They wrapped around it, softened it, outlasted it. Because laws are powerful, but culture is patient. And the people who lived here, who loved here, weren't just subjects of a distant king. They were custodians of stories, makers of meaning, keepers of forest truth. You step through a patch of sunlight and feel, just for a moment, that the forest is watching, not with suspicion, but with recognition. You've walked quietly. You've listened well, and you've come far enough to know that the forest isn't only ruled by law, it's ruled by memory. You feel the shift before you see it. The lightening of the air, the gentler rustle of leaves, the way your boots no longer sink so deeply into moss but land on firmer earth. The forest is beginning to let you go, and it feels almost reluctant. You step into a broad glade where the trees pull back like curtains, revealing a small, still pond. Its surface is so smooth, so perfect, that for a moment it doesn't look like water. It looks like polished obsidian, a mirror cut into the ground by time and rain. You walk to its edge, crouch, and peer in. You expect your own face. But instead, what you see is everything else. Not in reflection, but in memory. The forest plays tricks that way. It doesn't just show you what's there. It shows you what's been there. A deer drinking, quiet and watchful. A boy, just a boy, carrying too much firewood and a lie about where he found it. A woman kneeling to wash a pot, glancing over her shoulder in case someone calls her name with bad intentions. A verdure standing stiffly by the shore, reading aloud a fine to a crowd that has stopped listening to an outlaw, ankle deep in the shallows, washing blood from his hands. Or maybe mud. Or maybe nothing at all. You stare into the pond until the ripples erase the images. Then you sit. Because this is where the story slows, not ends, just slows. Let's talk about what remains. The laws are gone, mostly. Repealed. Forgotten. folded into new laws or buried in footnotes no one reads. The verderers and agisters and foresters have left, replaced by hikers, birdwatchers, and the occasional ranger with a clipboard. The courts no longer meet under oaks. No one brands your cheek for catching a rabbit. No child is whipped for wandering off the path. But the forest remembers. Mainstream historians sometimes treat forest law like a curiosity, a medieval oddity, a side note in the long march of governance. But to the people who lived under it, it was the shape of their world, the walls of their days, the background hum of every decision. And even now, long after the laws have faded, the shapes remain. That path you followed, worn not by boots but by custom. That clearing where the villagers argued, still called Gather's Hollow, according to a hand-carved sign nailed to a birch trunk. That grove where the monks planted hazel, still evenly spaced, though no one remembers why. Here's your final quirky tidbit. In some modern forests, especially those still managed under ancient charters, there are individuals who hold titles like commoner or verderer not in function, but in name. A nod to the past. A living title worn lightly. They no longer issue fines. They plant trees, monitor deer, advise on trail upkeep. But the words survive, like ghosts made of ink. You lie back beside the pond, looking up at the sky through the canopy. Sunlight filters down in golden stripes. Birds chatter softly above. A breeze tickles your sleeve. And it occurs to you, this might be the first moment you've truly rested since you entered the greenwood. Because for so long, the forest was not a place for rest. It was a place of tension, of lines drawn in bark, of choices made with consequences hidden beneath moss. But not anymore. Now, it's a place of story. You've walked its paths, heard its truths, and carried its weight. Not as burden, but as witness, and that, perhaps, is the final form of forest law, to remember. Not the scrolls or seals, but the people, the boy with the bow and no deer, the monk with a secret orchard, the outlaw with a better map, the woman with her hands in the brambles, gathering what wasn't hers, but should have been. The forest didn't just contain them. It kept them. And now you carry them too. You rise. One last look at the pond. And then, with no fanfare, you walk on toward whatever edge lies ahead. Because you've earned your way out. And the forest, it knows when to release what it loves. The path becomes pathless again, not in confusion but in choice. There are openings everywhere now. Clearings, game trails, even a faint rutted track, old enough to have forgotten its purpose but polite enough to offer passage. The forest, it seems, no longer needs to test you. You walk more slowly now, not because you're tired, but because you don't want to rush. You've spent hours with this woodland. Its history, its humor, its hunger, and to leave it feels like closing a book mid-sentence. But all stories, even the slow ones, wind down eventually. You pause beside a hawthorn tree. Its branches crooked, its blossoms just past their prime. A small knot in the trunk catches your eye, and for no good reason you reach out and touch it. It's warm from the sun, solid, real, and then something flickers at the edge of your thoughts. The forest laws may have ended on parchment, but in you, they've just begun again. Not in fear, not in punishment. In understanding. You think back to all you've seen. The poachers with their guilty grins, the monks with their clever forestry, the charcoal burners and the barefoot children, the angry villagers, the silent trees that watched it all. You think of the court circles, the deer paths, the lean-tos, the forgotten songs, the sacred mushrooms, the bramble scars. They weren't part of some distant world. They are the world. They're what happens when people live with land that belongs to someone else, but still needs to belong to them, too. They're what happens when survival becomes poetry. And what's left behind, after the fines and punishments and boundaries fade, is a way of seeing. One that notices the shape of a leaf in autumn and wonders who used to boil it into tea. One that steps lightly, not out of fear, but out of respect. One that knows not every path is legal, and not every law is right. One that remembers. You round a final bend and find, at last, the edge of the woods. A simple stone gate. No guards, no inscription, just a gap between trees where the land flattens into fields again. Far ahead, the outline of a cottage. A thin trail of smoke from a chimney. The echo of geese in a distant pond. You step forward, past the trees, and turn back for a moment. The forest stands still behind you. It does not call you back. It doesn't need to. Because you'll carry it with you now, in your steps, in your gaze, in the way you'll tell stories to someone else, someday, about the time you walked the greenwood, and listened, and learned, and left something of yourself beneath its boughs. Let your breath ease now. Let the rustle of leaves become softer, slower. The forest is behind you, but its rhythm remains, gentle, patient, endless. You walked far tonight, through centuries of silence and stories. Through branches that held laws older than kings and roots that knew things no clerk ever wrote down. You didn't just hear history. You felt it. The kind of history that doesn't need battles or thrones or dates to matter. The kind that grows slowly, quietly, like ivy on stone. And now, as your body settles and your thoughts drift further and further from the path, you can let it all fade. The deer, the fires, the moss, the stinging nettles and the laughter that made them worth it. The laws that told you where to walk, and the stories that told you where to pause. You're safe now. No verdiers. No fines. No boundary stones. Only soft earth beneath you, and the memory of trees swaying above. Let the forest hum become silence. Let the silence become stillness. Let the stillness become sleep. You've walked the long path through law and legend. You've earned your rest. Close your eyes. Let go. The forest will remember you, and it will wait. Always.